You can't just take her. She's my grandchild.
No, Mom, you need to leave now. Please.
Just let me see her.
I said go. I just wanted to see him. We'll call you later. Let's just go. I made this for you. Why won't you let me in? We're not ready. You have to leave. Just take the blanket. Just leave.
The day my grandson was born, I stood outside his hospital room holding a handmade blanket stitched with pieces of my late husband's favorite shirt. I thought I was about to meet the little boy who would carry our family into another generation. Instead, my son Ethan stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. "Mom, Claire doesn't want you in there. Please just go home. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Behind that door, Claire's parents were already holding my grandson. I wasn't even allowed to see him. I walked into the elevator still clutching the blanket when my phone buzzed. It was my attorney, Rebecca. "The acquisition closed this morning. You officially own the building." I stared at those words through my tears. My son had just thrown me out. He had no idea who he had thrown out. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone you loved, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories about family dignity and the truths people discover too late mean something to you, please like this video and subscribe. Because what happened after I left that hospital changed my family forever. The mother they thought they knew. If you had met me 6 months before Benjamin was born, you probably would have believed exactly what my son believed about me. You would have seen a 68-year-old widow living alone in an old brick house on the south side of Richmond, Virginia. You would have seen the same silver Toyota Camry in my driveway that I had driven for nearly 14 years. You might have noticed that I bought my groceries with coupons, wore sensible shoes, and still used a leather handbag I had owned since before Ethan graduated from college. Nothing about me suggested wealth. That was intentional. Thomas and I had never believed money needed an audience. When we married, we had almost none of it. I was 24 and working as a bookkeeper for a small plumbing supply company. Thomas was 27 and worked construction, mostly renovation jobs in neighborhoods where old houses had good bones and bad roofs. Our first apartment had one bedroom, unreliable heat, and a kitchen window that rattled whenever a truck drove past. I loved it. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't. I loved it because it was ours. On Friday nights, Thomas would come home covered in drywall dust, and I would sit at our tiny kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, adding up what we had earned and what we could save. Thomas used to tease me about those numbers. "You know exactly where every dollar goes, don't you, Mel?" "I know where every dollar should go," I'd tell him. That difference became the foundation of our marriage. Thomas could walk through a neglected building and see what it might become. I could look at the numbers and tell him whether his dream would bankrupt us. We balanced each other. When I was 28, we bought our first duplex. It wasn't impressive. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The upstairs bathroom leaked into the kitchen downstairs. Half the windows needed replacing, and the previous owner had painted one bedroom a shade of orange so bright Thomas said it could guide airplanes home at night. We put nearly every dollar we had into the down payment. Then we moved into one side and rented the other. Thomas repaired the building himself after work. I handled rent invoices, taxes, insurance, and every receipt down to the last box of nails. 2 years later, we bought another property, then another. But our lifestyle barely changed. That was partly because we were cautious. Mostly it was because Ethan had been born. The first time I held my son, money stopped feeling like something to accumulate and started feeling like something that could create choices. We wanted Ethan to have choices we hadn't had. A safe home, a good education, the freedom to choose a career instead of taking whichever job paid the electricity bill. But Thomas was adamant about one thing. "We give him opportunity," he told me once, "not entitlement." So Ethan grew up mowing our lawn. He had chores. When he wanted an expensive pair of sneakers in high school, we told him we would pay what a normal pair cost, and he could earn the difference. He complained bitterly for 2 weeks. Then he got a weekend job at a grocery store. Thomas was so proud he bought the sneakers anyway. I made him return them. "You'll ruin the lesson," I said. Thomas laughed for 10 minutes. That was us. We could have moved into a much larger house by the time Ethan was in middle school, but we stayed where we were. We could have bought luxury cars. We didn't. Whenever one of our properties produced extra income, we reinvested it. Duplexes became small apartment buildings. Small apartment buildings led to larger opportunities. By the time Ethan left for college, Thomas and I owned more than he realized. Much more. But Ethan never asked, and we never told him. He knew his father worked in property development. He knew I handled accounting and eventually stopped working for anyone else. But he thought we were comfortable, not wealthy. That suited us. When Ethan graduated, Thomas and I paid his tuition without loans. Ethan knew that. What he didn't know was that his tuition represented less than the annual income of one of our apartment properties. When he got his first job, we celebrated at a neighborhood Italian restaurant we had visited for years. When he received his first promotion, Thomas gave him his old watch. Nothing about our lives told Ethan there was an empire quietly growing behind the scenes. And perhaps that was where Thomas and I made our first mistake. We taught Ethan not to worship money, but we never taught him what to do if he started worshiping appearances. That came later. Thomas died 9 years before Ben was born. Even now there are moments when saying those words feels unnatural. He had gone to his doctor because he was tired. 3 months later, I was sitting beside a hospital bed holding the hand of the man who had held mine for more than 40 years. Thomas wasn't afraid of dying. I was angry enough for both of us. One night near the end, he opened his eyes and found me sitting beside him with financial documents spread across my lap. He smiled weakly, still counting every dollar. I tried to smile back. Somebody has to. His fingers tightened around mine. Don't let the money become the family. I didn't understand why he said it then. Years later, I would. After Thomas died, Ethan assumed I would sell everything connected to his father's business. I did sell a few properties that no longer fit our plans. But I didn't walk away. I reorganized. I hired people smarter than me in areas where I needed help. I worked closely with Rebecca Lawson, who had been our attorney and friend for years. I moved our holdings into a more professional structure and gradually expanded into commercial property and senior housing. But I did all of it quietly. There were no magazine profiles, no photographs of me cutting ribbons, no social media posts from expensive resorts. Most people dealing with our company worked with executives rather than directly with me. I liked it that way. And Ethan never showed much curiosity. After the funeral, he came to my house and asked whether I would be financially all right. I remember looking at him across my kitchen table. He seemed genuinely worried. "I'll be fine," I said. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. In his mind, Thomas had been the businessman. I had been his wife who kept the books. Ethan assumed the business had been smaller than it was, and that whatever remained had been divided, sold, or consumed by medical expenses and retirement. I could have corrected him in 5 minutes. I didn't. At first there was no reason. Then something began happening that I found strangely touching. Ethan started paying for dinner. "Put that away, Mom," he'd say whenever I reached for my wallet. The first few times I let him. It made him proud. Once after my water heater needed replacing, Ethan handed me an envelope with $500. "For the repair." I pushed it back. "I can pay for my own water heater." "I know, just take it." He looked so much like Thomas in that moment that I eventually accepted the envelope. I still have those $500. I never spent them. For a while I thought Ethan's concern was beautiful. My son believed his widowed mother might need help, and he wanted to provide it. What mother wouldn't be touched by that? But slowly concern became a story, and the story began changing. At a Christmas dinner, I heard Ethan tell Claire's father that he had been helping Mom out since Dad died. I noticed the wording, "helping me out." Later he told someone else that maintaining my old house was becoming difficult for me. That wasn't true. Another time, Claire thanked Ethan in front of me for being so generous with your mother. I waited for Ethan to correct her. He didn't. I told myself it didn't matter. I knew the truth. Why should I care what anyone else believed? Then one Sunday afternoon, Ethan came by with groceries I hadn't requested. He put them on my kitchen counter and looked around the room where he had eaten breakfast as a boy. You know, Mom, eventually we should talk about downsizing. I stared at him. Downsizing from what, this place? I almost laughed. My house was modest by almost anyone's standards. Ethan, this house is paid for. I know. I'm just thinking ahead. To what? He hesitated. Your future. Something in his expression bothered me. Not cruelty. Not yet. It was assumption. My son had created an entire version of my life without ever asking whether it was true. In that version, I was aging financially limited and increasingly dependent on him. And the strangest part was that he seemed to need that version of me. It made him feel successful, important, necessary. That evening after he left, I called Rebecca. She listened while I told her everything. Do you want to correct? She asked. I looked through my kitchen window at Thomas's old maple tree in the backyard. I don't know. He'll find out eventually. I know. Rebecca was silent for a moment. Then she asked, what are you waiting to learn? That question stayed with me, because somewhere deep inside I already knew the answer. I wanted to know who my son would be if he believed I had nothing he wanted. No company, no buildings, no investment portfolio, no inheritance worth imagining. Just me, his mother. I wanted to believe that would be enough. So I continued driving my old Toyota. I continued clipping coupons because waste had always irritated me. I let Ethan pick up restaurant checks. And whenever he told someone he was taking care of me, I swallowed the discomfort and reminded myself that one day the truth would come out naturally. I never imagined that before it did, my own son would stand outside a hospital room and decide I wasn't important enough to meet my grandson. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether I should have told him everything at that kitchen table. Maybe wealth would have changed how Ethan treated me. But that was exactly what frightened me. Because respect that appears only after someone discovers your bank balance isn't respect, and love that depends on what you might inherit isn't love. At 68, I thought I understood that lesson. I didn't yet understand how painfully my own family was about to teach it to me. How I became an embarrassment. When Ethan first introduced me to Claire, I liked her. That is important for me to say, because it would be easy, knowing what happened later, to pretend I recognized something cruel in her from the beginning. I didn't. Claire was 31, then polished without seeming pretentious, quick to smile and unusually good at making people feel noticed. She worked in marketing for a luxury real estate company in Richmond and seemed genuinely interested when I talked about Thomas. The first Christmas she spent with us, she helped me wash dishes after dinner. You raised a good man, she told me. I believed her. More importantly, I believed Ethan was happy. For the first few years of their marriage, we got along well. Claire called me for recipes. She remembered my birthday. Sometimes she and Ethan came over on Sunday afternoons, and the three of us would sit in my kitchen drinking coffee. Then Ethan's career began moving faster. He joined Jonathan Pierce's development company and discovered that in his industry, relationships could be almost as valuable as results. Suddenly, there were fundraising dinners, private receptions, country club events, and weekends spent entertaining potential investors. Claire understood that world naturally, or perhaps she simply wanted to belong to it badly enough to learn every rule. Their clothes changed first, then their cars, then their friends. And eventually the way they looked at me changed too. It began with things so small I could easily dismiss them. One afternoon, Claire came to pick me up for lunch and stared at my Toyota. Melissa, you're still driving this. I smiled. It still starts. She laughed. I know, but Ethan could help you get something newer. I could help myself get something newer. For a second, she looked confused. Then she smiled as though I had made a joke. A few months later, we were preparing for a charity dinner connected to Ethan's company. Claire called me the afternoon before. What are you wearing tomorrow? I described a navy dress I had owned for several years. There was a pause. The one with the little jacket? Yes. Another pause. Maybe we should go shopping. I looked down at the dress hanging on my bedroom door. Why? It's just a pretty formal crowd. So is the dress. I know. I just thought you might enjoy something more current. Her voice remained sweet. That was Claire's gift. She could make criticism sound like concern. I bought nothing new. At the dinner, I noticed Claire looking at my dress twice. Nobody else seemed to care. That should have been the end of it. Instead, invitations slowly became less frequent. Ethan would mention dinners after they happened. "We thought you'd be tired." Or, "It was mostly business people." Or my favorite, "You wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway." Apparently everyone except me had become an expert on what I enjoyed. I didn't confront him. Perhaps I should have. But when you're a mother, you become skilled at explaining away the small ways your adult children hurt you. They're busy. They're under pressure. Marriage changes priorities. You don't want to be demanding. You don't want to become the mother who complains every time her son spends a holiday with his wife's family. So you accept one disappointment, then another. Eventually, you look around and realize disappointment has become the shape of the relationship. The strangest part was that Claire never openly insulted me. She was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, she explained me. At a brunch one Sunday, one of her friends complimented my handbag. Before I could answer, Claire smiled. "Melissa keeps everything forever. She's very simple that way." "Very simple." The woman nodded approvingly. "That's probably healthier." I smiled. Nobody at that table knew the handbag had been sitting beside me the morning I signed documents approving an $11 million acquisition. Nobody needed to know. Still, something about Claire reducing my entire life to simplicity bothered me. Not because I was ashamed of living simply, because she had begun confusing simplicity with limitation. Then Claire became pregnant. The morning Ethan called to tell me, every irritation disappeared. "Mom," he said, and I could hear something trembling in his voice. "You're going to be a grandmother." I sat down immediately. For one ridiculous second, I looked toward Thomas's empty chair. I wanted him there so badly. "A baby," Ethan laughed. "That's usually how it works." I cried. So did he. That night I went upstairs and opened a cedar chest containing several of Thomas's things I had never been able to give away. His favorite blue cotton shirt was folded near the bottom. He had worn it on fishing trips while repairing our first duplex and in countless photographs with Ethan. I pressed it against my face. Then I knew what I wanted to make. My mother had taught me quilting when I was a girl. I hadn't made one in years, but I decided our grandchild should have something connecting him to the grandfather he would never meet. I chose soft gray and blue fabric and carefully incorporated small pieces of Thomas's shirt. I worked slowly. Every stitch felt like memory. For a while, the baby seemed to bring Claire and me closer again. She asked questions about Ethan as an infant. Was he colicky? When did he sleep through the night? Had he been a difficult baby? I loved answering. I pulled out old photographs. I told her how Ethan used to refuse naps unless Thomas walked around the living room carrying him against his chest. I began cooking meals they could freeze after the birth. Lasagna, chicken pot pie, vegetable soup. Claire thanked me, but gradually I noticed she wanted my help only when it arrived at a distance. One afternoon I said, "I can stay a few nights after the baby comes if you need sleep." Claire's expression changed immediately. "Oh, that's sweet, but my mother will probably handle that." "Of course. You can visit, though." I smiled. "I assumed I could." She laughed awkwardly. "Obviously." But it wasn't obvious. A week later, Ethan called. "Claire's trying to create some boundaries for after the birth." The word boundaries caught my attention. With whom? Everyone. What boundaries? No unexpected visits, no staying too long, no giving advice unless she asks. I almost smiled. "Ethan, I raised you. I understand that new parents need space." "I know. I'm just telling everybody." But I later learned Patricia and Richard were planning to stay nearby for nearly 2 weeks. I said nothing. The moment that truly changed something in me came during the baby shower. Claire's family hosted it at a private event space overlooking the James River. Everything was pale blue and cream, from the flowers to the tiny iced cookies arranged beside champagne glasses. I arrived early because Claire had asked me to bring 2 framed photographs of Ethan as a baby. After placing them on a table, I went looking for tape. I heard voices from a small room near the kitchen. Claire and Ethan. I wasn't trying to listen. Then I heard my name. Your mother means well, Claire said. Ethan sighed. Then what's the problem? She's already making blankets and freezing food and talking about helping after the baby comes. That's what grandmothers do. I know, but I don't want this baby becoming her retirement project. I stopped. There are sentences that hurt because they're cruel. That one hurt because of what it assumed. That my life was empty. That I had been sitting alone in my little house waiting for a grandchild to give me purpose. That loving my grandson would somehow be an intrusion. I waited for Ethan to defend me. He didn't. Instead, he said quietly, "I'll talk to her." I stood in that hallway holding a roll of tape I no longer remembered picking up. For the first time, Claire's opinion mattered less to me than Ethan's silence. He knew me, or I had believed he did. I returned to the party before they saw me. 20 minutes later, Claire hugged me in front of her guests. "Thank you for everything, Melissa." I hugged her back. "You're welcome." Then I watched Ethan avoid my eyes. After that day, I stopped offering help unless they asked. I continued working on the blanket. I continued preparing for my grandson. But I no longer assumed there would be a place for me simply because I was family. Around the same time, I noticed something else changing in Ethan. He became distracted. At Sunday dinner, his phone stayed beside his plate. Every few minutes, he checked his email. Once Claire asked whether Jonathan had heard from the investors. Ethan's face tightened. "Not now." Another evening, I watched him step outside to take a call. Through the window, I saw him pacing across my porch, rubbing the back of his neck the way Thomas used to when money was tight during our early years. When Ethan returned, I asked, "Everything all right at work?" "Fine." "You don't look fine." "It's just a project." "Anything you want to talk about?" His expression softened for half a second. Then Claire walked into the room. "No," he said. "I've got it handled." I didn't push. But I knew numbers and I knew fear. Ethan wasn't simply stressed. Something was at risk. Over the next several weeks, his anxiety increased, while his life became more extravagant. He and Claire ordered new furniture for the nursery. They discussed replacing Claire's SUV. They attended dinners with investors. Every photograph they posted showed confidence. Every time I saw Ethan privately, I saw worry. That contradiction disturbed me. One evening after they left my house, I stood at the window watching their expensive car disappear down the street. Thomas used to say that people rarely drown because they don't see the water. They drown because they keep telling themselves they can still touch the bottom. I wondered whether Ethan was doing exactly that. At the time, I believed the greatest danger was financial. I had no idea that his fear of losing status was already changing the way he saw his own mother. And I certainly didn't know that before my grandson was even placed in my arms, Ethan would decide protecting the image of his perfect life mattered more than protecting me. The money behind their perfect life. For most of my life, numbers had told me things people were too proud to say out loud. A bank statement could reveal fear. A credit card bill could reveal loneliness. A mortgage could reveal ambition. And debt, especially the kind people accumulated while insisting everything was fine, could reveal desperation. By the final months of Claire's pregnancy, I had begun to suspect that Ethan's beautiful life was being held together by numbers he didn't want anyone to examine too closely. From the outside, my son looked successful. He and Claire lived in a 5-bedroom house in one of Richmond's more desirable neighborhoods. Their kitchen had marble countertops, custom cabinets, and a refrigerator that probably cost more than Thomas and I had paid for our first car. 2 expensive vehicles sat in the driveway. Claire belonged to a private fitness club. Ethan had joined a country club because, as he once explained, half the real conversations happen on the golf course. They took vacations I never would have considered taking at their age. Charleston for long weekends, Napa for an anniversary, a resort in Arizona for Claire's birthday. None of those things were wrong. If you can afford something and it brings you joy. I have never believed suffering makes a person more virtuous. What concerned me was the distance between the life they displayed and the anxiety I saw whenever nobody else was watching. One Sunday, Ethan came to my house for coffee without Claire. That alone was unusual. He sat at my kitchen table scrolling through his phone while I sliced banana bread. "How's the nursery?" I asked. "Done." Already. Claire wanted everything ready. I placed a slice in front of him. That must have cost a little. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything costs a little. His phone buzzed. He looked at it immediately. The color seemed to drain from his face. Bad news. No. He turned the phone face down. I waited. Ethan picked up his coffee. Mom, you ever think about selling this place? There it was again. My house. Yeah. No. He smiled as though I were being stubborn. You don't need all this space. I looked around my modest 3-bedroom house. Ethan, you have bathrooms larger than my guest room. You know what I mean. Actually, I didn't, but I was beginning to understand. Are you worried about my expenses? I'm always thinking about you. That's not what I asked. He stared at me. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me whatever was wrong. Instead, he leaned back. Forget it. After he left, I called Rebecca. Not because I wanted her to investigate my son. I didn't need to. The business world in Richmond was smaller than people imagined, particularly when commercial property was involved. Rebecca and I were already reviewing a potential acquisition called Riverside Exchange. The property was an aging commercial complex near the river built decades earlier when offices had been designed for a very different economy. It wasn't beautiful, but the land was valuable, the structure was sound, and the location had enormous potential. Grant Community Holdings had been studying it for months. Our plan was conservative: acquire the property, stabilize existing tenants, then determine whether redevelopment made financial sense. That afternoon, Rebecca sent me an updated project file. I opened it at my dining room table. Halfway through, I saw a familiar company name: Pierce Development Group. Jonathan Pierce, Ethan's employer. I sat straighter. Pierce Development had proposed a redevelopment partnership involving Riverside Exchange, and Ethan was listed as one of the lead development managers. I read the page twice. Then I called Rebecca. Did you know Ethan was attached to Riverside? I knew Pierce was involved. I didn't realize Ethan was leading their internal team until the latest documents came through. How significant is it for him? Personally, yes. She paused. Very. That one word explained months of tension. Rebecca continued. Pierce has spent heavily positioning for this project. They're expecting redevelopment rights after the ownership transition. Expecting? That's the problem. I knew that tone. Tell me. The financing structure isn't as strong as Jonathan presented 6 months ago. I leaned back in my chair. How weak? Not fatal. But one investor has become nervous, construction estimates increased, and Pierce is relying on projected commitments that aren't finalized. That sounded like Jonathan Pierce. He was intelligent and charismatic, but he had a habit of treating optimism as if it belonged on a balance sheet. And Ethan, his name is attached to some aggressive projections. My stomach tightened. How aggressive? Enough that if the project works, he looks brilliant. And if it doesn't, Rebecca didn't answer immediately. He'll have questions to answer. I closed my eyes. Suddenly I could see Ethan checking his phone at dinner. The pacing, the short answers, the obsession with appearances. He wasn't merely ambitious. He had tied his professional identity to Riverside. Over the next few weeks I paid closer attention. Not by spying, by listening. People reveal more than they realize when they assume you don't understand their world. At Claire's house one evening, I heard Ethan discussing Riverside with Richard Whitmore. Richard had spent decades in insurance and liked giving advice even when nobody requested it. This is your shot, Richard told Ethan. If Riverside closes the way Jonathan expects, I'll be in a very different position next year. Equity, eventually. Partnership. Ethan smiled. That's the conversation. Claire looked at him proudly. Which is why we're not panicking about the house. I was sitting only a few feet away. What about the house? I asked. Silence. Claire answered first. Nothing. We refinanced. Why? For flexibility. I looked at Ethan. He avoided my eyes. There was nothing inherently alarming about refinancing a home, but the tone told me more than the words. Later that night, Rebecca and I reviewed public filings and information related to Pierce's project structure. The picture became clearer. Ethan and Claire weren't bankrupt, not even close, but they were stretched. Their lifestyle depended on Ethan's income continuing to rise. The mortgage, the cars, memberships, credit, and most dangerously expectations. They had begun spending tomorrow's success today. Then I discovered something that hurt me more than the debt. Years earlier, when Ethan and Claire bought their first home, Thomas and I had decided to help them. We didn't want Ethan to know the full source, so the money had been structured as an early family gift through an account Ethan understood to contain modest proceeds from his father's estate. It was enough to give them a strong financial start. I had assumed that money remained part of their home equity. It didn't. Some had later been released during refinancing. A portion had eventually made its way into an investment opportunity connected to Ethan's professional ambitions. That bothered me, but not nearly as much as what I learned during dinner at their house 2 weeks later. Claire was telling Patricia about Ethan's investment. Ethan was smart, she said proudly. He built that capital himself instead of depending on family money. Patricia smiled at my son. That's how men used to do it. I looked at Ethan. He looked at his plate. I knew where his first real financial foundation had come from. Maybe he didn't know how much Thomas and I had possessed. Maybe he believed it was a small gift, but he knew he hadn't built everything alone. He said nothing. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. Disappointment. There is a particular sadness in watching your child rewrite his own history because the truth no longer fits the person he wants others to see. On my drive home, I remembered Ethan at 17, standing in our kitchen, proudly showing Thomas his first paycheck from the grocery store. He had earned less than $200. Thomas had treated that check as if it were $1 million. Never be ashamed of where your money comes from, he'd told him, as long as you earned it honestly. Somewhere along the way, Ethan had become ashamed not of dishonesty, but of having been helped, because accepting help from ordinary parents didn't fit the image he was building. The next morning, Rebecca called. "We have movement on Riverside." I was pouring coffee. "What kind?" "The seller accepted our final structure." I stopped. "So we're moving toward closing. Assuming due diligence finishes cleanly, yes." I walked toward the window. Thomas's maple tree had begun losing its leaves. "What about Pierce?" "They'll remain a prospective development partner, but the existing assumptions don't automatically carry over. Once we own Riverside, they'll need our approval on the redevelopment agreement." "Our approval," I repeated. "Your approval ultimately." I didn't answer. Rebecca knew why. "Melissa, does Ethan know you're connected to Grant Community Holdings?" "No." "Does he even know you're still active in commercial property?" "Not really." She sighed softly. "This could become complicated." I almost laughed. Complicated seemed inadequate. My son was betting his career on Riverside Exchange. He had stretched his finances because he believed the project would propel him toward partnership. His wife was already spending emotionally against a future bonus, and neither of them had any idea that the supposedly modest widow they worried might need help paying for a water heater was about to become the controlling owner of the property beneath Ethan's biggest professional gamble. "Do you want me to disclose the relationship?" Rebecca asked. "No." "Are you sure? Would we disclose that relationship if Ethan weren't my son?" "No." "Then don't change the process because he is." Rebecca was quiet. "That's very Thomas of you." I smiled sadly. He would have said the same thing. After the call, I remained at the window. I didn't feel powerful. I felt worried, because I had spent years believing Ethan's misunderstanding about my finances was harmless. Now money, pride, family, and business were quietly moving toward the same intersection, and I could already sense the collision coming. What I didn't know was that before Ethan ever discovered I controlled Riverside Exchange, he would give me a reason to question whether he deserved any protection from me at all. The night before Ben was born, Claire went into labor 11 days early. I remember the exact time because the red numbers on my bedside clock read 11:47 p.m. when my phone began vibrating across the nightstand. For one confused second, I thought something had happened to one of our properties. Rebecca was one of the few people who occasionally called me that late. Then I saw Ethan's name. Mom. The moment I heard his voice, I sat upright. Ethan, what's wrong? I think it's happening. What is... The baby. Claire's contractions are 5 minutes apart. Maybe 4. I don't know. She says they're getting stronger. Behind him, I could hear Claire telling him to stop pacing. Despite everything that had happened between us, I smiled. Have you called her doctor? Yes. They said to come in. Then why are you calling me? A pause. I don't know. That answer nearly broke my heart. Because suddenly he wasn't 41-year-old Ethan Grant, ambitious development manager with the expensive house and carefully tailored suits. He was my little boy again, scared, looking for his mother. Listen to me, I said. Put the hospital bag in the car. Make sure Claire has her identification and insurance information. Take a towel for the seat if you're worried about her water breaking. And Ethan, yeah, drive normally. I'm driving normally. You're still in the house. That earned a nervous laugh. For the next 10 minutes, I stayed on the phone while he gathered things he had apparently packed weeks earlier and then forgotten where he had put. Before hanging up, he said, "Are you coming?" The question surprised me. Do you want me there? Yeah, I think so. Just come. I'll be there. I dressed quickly. Then I went into the spare bedroom where the blanket waited. I had finished it 3 days earlier. Soft blue and gray squares surrounded smaller pieces cut from Thomas's old shirt. In one corner, I had stitched a tiny line by hand. From those who loved you before you arrived. No names, no dates, just that. I folded the blanket carefully and placed it in a gift bag beside several containers of food I had prepared for Ethan and Claire. Then I drove toward the hospital through nearly empty Richmond streets. It was one of those quiet Virginia nights when the city seemed to be holding its breath. I thought about Thomas almost the entire way. He should have been beside me. He would have complained that I was driving too slowly and then told me to slow down 2 minutes later. He would have cried the moment he saw Ethan holding his own child. I wish you were here, I whispered. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine that this baby might soften everything. Perhaps Claire's pregnancy had made everyone tense. Perhaps Ethan's work problems had made him distracted. Perhaps once Ben arrived, all those small injuries would seem unimportant. Families survive difficult seasons. I believed ours could too. When I reached the maternity floor, Ethan was pacing outside Claire's room. His shirt was untucked and his hair looked as though he had run his hands through it 100 times. The moment he saw me, he hugged me. Not the polite hug he had been giving me lately. A real one. I'm terrified. I know. What if something goes wrong? Then she's surrounded by people who know what they're doing. He looked toward the door. She's in so much pain. And you're discovering the first great truth of fatherhood. What? Sometimes the person you love is hurting, and your job isn't to fix it. It's just to stay. He stared at me for a second. Dad used to say things like that. No. Your father would have said, "Don't faint and embarrass us." Ethan laughed. For those few minutes, I had my son back. Then the elevator doors opened. Patricia and Richard Whitmore stepped out. Patricia was wearing a cream coat over clothes that looked far too carefully chosen for midnight. Richard carried 2 coffees and an overnight bag. Ethan. Patricia hurried toward him. He immediately straightened. The transformation was subtle, but I saw it. His shoulders went back. His expression changed. He became the version of himself he wore around Claire's family. Patricia hugged him and then noticed me. "Oh, Melissa, you're here." Not rude, just surprised. "Ethan called me." "Of course." Richard shook my hand. "Big night." "It certainly is." Within 15 minutes, Patricia was inside Claire's room. Richard went in shortly afterward. I remained outside. At first, I didn't mind. Claire was the patient. She had every right to decide who was around her during labor. I settled into a chair with my gift bag at my feet. Ethan came and went several times. Each time he seemed more distracted. Around 2 in the morning. Patricia stepped into the hallway, while Ethan stood near the vending machines. I was around the corner getting water. They didn't know I could hear them. "You look exhausted. Patricia said. I'm fine. You've got enough to worry about without taking care of everyone else. What does that mean? Nothing. I just hope you're remembering that your priorities change once you have a child. I know. Claire told me you've been helping your mother financially. I froze. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Patricia continued. That's admirable, but you have a family now. I waited for him to laugh, or correct her, or say my mother doesn't need my money. Instead, Ethan sighed. It's not that much. My fingers tightened around the plastic water bottle. Patricia lowered her voice. Still, these things can grow. Once parents become dependent. Mom's okay. Is she? Another pause. She doesn't really have anyone else. I closed my eyes. 4 words. That was all it took. She doesn't really have anyone else. As though I were some lonely old woman clinging to my son because my husband was dead and my bank account was empty. As though Ethan were carrying me. The irony was almost unbearable. That very afternoon, I had approved final revisions on a commercial acquisition worth more money than Patricia probably imagined I had seen in my lifetime. But it wasn't the lie about money that hurt. It was the way Ethan allowed me to become smaller so he could appear larger. I stepped backward before they saw me. For several minutes, I stood in an empty corridor, staring through a window at Richmond's distant lights. I thought about walking over to Patricia and telling her the truth. I could have done it in one sentence. Actually, Patricia, your daughter and son-in-law aren't supporting me. If anything, the financial structure beneath the most important project of Ethan's career may soon belong to my company. I imagined her face. Then I imagined Ethan's. And I said nothing. Because humiliation wasn't what I wanted. I wanted my son to tell the truth when there was nothing to gain from it. That mattered more. By 3:30, contractions were coming quickly. The atmosphere changed. Nurses moved faster. Ethan disappeared into Claire's room and stayed there. I sat alone. The food containers remained beside my feet. The blanket rested on my lap. At 4:12 a.m., my phone vibrated. For a second, my heart jumped. But it wasn't Ethan. Rebecca. She had sent an email with the subject line, Riverside Final Closing Items. I opened it. There were updated documents, final conditions, and a note saying the seller wanted confirmation before business opened. I almost laughed at the absurdity. There I was, sitting beneath fluorescent hospital lights in sensible shoes, holding a handmade baby blanket, while people a few yards away apparently believed my son was helping pay my bills. Meanwhile, attorneys and executives were waiting for my authorization on a multi-million-dollar transaction. I replied with 3 sentences. Proceed as discussed. No changes to the approved terms. Call me if anything material arises. Then I put the phone away. At 5:06, Ethan came through the doors. His eyes were wet. I stood immediately. He's here. My hands flew to my mouth. Ben. Ethan nodded. Benjamin Thomas Grant. Thomas. For a moment I couldn't speak. He has Dad's name, middle name. I hugged my son. This time we both cried. Is Claire all right? She's exhausted. But she's okay. He's okay. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Thank God. I held Ethan's face between my hands. You're a father. He laughed through his tears. I know. How does it feel? Terrifying. Good. That means you understand the job. He laughed again. I looked toward the doors. Can I see him? The smile faded slightly. Claire's resting. Of course, I'll wait. Mom. It's fine. I've been waiting this long. Patricia appeared behind him. He's perfect, she announced. She had already seen him. I felt a small sting but pushed it aside. Claire had just given birth. This was not about me. I sat back down. An hour passed, then another. Richard went inside. Patricia returned inside. At one point, Claire's sister arrived and was allowed through. I remained in the hallway. The sun began rising over Richmond. Hospital staff changed shifts. My coffee went cold. Finally, Ethan came out again. He didn't sit beside me. That was when I knew. Mom, Claire wants to keep things really quiet. I looked at him. I'm being quiet. That's not what I mean. My eyes moved toward the closed door behind him. I've been here all night, Ethan. I know. I brought food. I brought Ben's blanket. I don't need to stay. I just want to see my grandson. He rubbed his forehead. Claire only wants immediate family right now. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. Behind that door were Claire's mother and father. Her sister had just walked in 20 minutes earlier. I looked directly at my son. Immediate family. His jaw tightened. Mom, please. Something cold settled inside my chest. I looked down at the blue gift bag by my feet, then back at Ethan. Am I not immediate family anymore? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That silence told me exactly where I stood. What neither Ethan nor anyone else on that maternity floor knew was that while I had been sitting there all night waiting for permission to meet my grandson, the final pieces of the Riverside acquisition had been moving into place. By the end of that morning, my son's two worlds were about to become connected in a way he could never have imagined. But first, he was going to make sure I understood that in his perfect new family, there was no room for me. He told me to leave. There are moments when your life changes loudly. A doctor says your husband's cancer has spread. A telephone rings in the middle of the night. A baby takes his first breath. And then there are moments when everything changes so quietly that nobody else in the room notices. For me, it happened in a hospital hallway at 7 in the morning. Am I not immediate family anymore? Ethan looked at the floor. That was my answer. Behind the closed door, I could hear voices. Patricia was laughing softly. Someone said something about Ben's tiny fingers. A nurse walked past carrying a tray. Life continued normally while something inside me cracked. Ethan. He finally looked at me. It's not about that. Then what is it about? Claire's exhausted. I understand. She had a difficult night. I was here for it. He rubbed both hands over his face. Mom, please don't make this a thing. I stared at him. A thing. I had sat in that hospital for nearly 7 hours. I had brought meals. I had brought a blanket containing pieces of his father's shirt. I had asked for nothing except 1 minute with my grandson. And somehow my hurt had become an inconvenience Ethan needed me to manage. I'm not trying to make anything a thing, I said quietly. I'm asking whether I can see Ben before I leave. Ethan glanced toward Claire's door. That tiny movement told me more than words could. He was afraid she might hear us. Not today. I felt my throat tighten. When? Maybe after they get settled at home. Tomorrow. I don't know. This weekend. Mom. What are you asking me, Ethan? His expression hardened, not because he hated me, but because guilt often turns into irritation when people don't want to face what they're doing. Claire needs space. I've given her space. Then give her a little more. How much? A couple of weeks, maybe. I honestly thought he was joking. A couple of weeks. We'll call you. I looked past him toward the door. Patricia had been inside. Richard had been inside. Claire's sister had been inside. I had watched flowers arrive from coworkers who would probably see photographs of Ben before I ever touched him. Does Claire's family need a couple of weeks too? Ethan's jaw tightened. That's different. Why, they're helping. I almost laughed. Instead, I looked down at the food I had spent 2 days preparing. 3 dinners, soup, breakfast muffins. Everything labeled with reheating instructions because I remembered how exhausted I had been after bringing Ethan home from the hospital. I'm helping too. I know. Do you? He exhaled. Mom, I can't do this right now. Do what? Do what? This. He gestured between us. I lowered my voice. Your wife doesn't want me around and you're too afraid to say it. That's not fair. Then tell me what's fair. He looked away. There was a time when Ethan could not lie to me. At 8 years old, he'd broken a lamp playing baseball inside the house and spent 20 minutes insisting the cat had done it. We didn't own a cat. Now he was 41 and somehow dishonesty had become more sophisticated. Claire thinks you can be a little intense. I stared at him. Intense. About the baby. I made a blanket. It's more than that. What else? The food, offering to stay, all the advice. I offered once to stay. She said no. I never asked again. That's not how she feels. There it was. Not what I had done. How Claire had decided to interpret it. I nodded slowly. And how do you feel? Ethan didn't answer. I waited. I wanted him to say that he knew me better, that he understood I wasn't trying to control their child, that I was his mother and deserved more than being discussed as a problem to manage. Instead, he said, I just need you to make this easier for me. Those words landed differently, because suddenly I understood. This wasn't about Claire needing space. It wasn't about the baby. It wasn't even entirely about me. Ethan wanted peace in his marriage approval from Claire's family and the appearance of control. And I was the easiest person to sacrifice because he believed I would always forgive him. Mothers often are. We become the safe person to disappoint, the person who will understand, the person who won't leave, the person expected to absorb whatever everyone else refuses to carry. I had done that for Ethan far too many times. I reached down and picked up the food bag. I'll go. His shoulders visibly relaxed. That hurt almost as much as everything else. Thank you. Thank you. As though I had finally agreed to behave, I took 2 steps before he noticed the gift bag. Is that for Ben? I looked down at the blanket. Yes. You can leave it. I'll give it to Claire. My hand tightened around the handles. For reasons I couldn't explain then, I couldn't leave it. Not yet. Mom. I said I'll go. He stopped. I walked toward the nurse's station. A nurse named Denise had checked on me several times during the night. She was probably in her 50s with kind eyes and the calm efficiency of someone who had seen every possible version of family joy and family dysfunction. Leaving, she asked. Apparently. She looked at my face but was gracious enough not to ask. I lifted the food bag. Would you make sure they get this? Of course. There are instructions on everything. She smiled gently. Grandmother cooking. I swallowed. Something like that. She took the bag. I kept the blanket. The elevator seemed to take forever. When the doors finally opened, I stepped inside alone. As they began closing, I looked down the corridor. For one foolish second, I hoped Ethan would come after me. He didn't. The doors shut. I stared at my reflection in the polished metal. My hair was slightly disheveled. My eyes were red from exhaustion. I was still wearing the cardigan I had thrown on shortly before midnight. I didn't look like the chairwoman of anything. I looked exactly like what everyone there believed I was, an aging widow who had overstayed her welcome. The elevator descended. My phone vibrated. I almost ignored it. Then I saw Rebecca's name. There was one message. The acquisition closed this morning. You officially own the building. Call me when you're free. I read it twice. Riverside Exchange was ours. Mine, ultimately. The building at the center of Ethan's professional future had changed hands while he was upstairs asking me to disappear from his personal life. I should tell you something about power. When people imagine having it, they often imagine how satisfying it would be to use, to expose someone, to humiliate them, to make them regret underestimating you. For perhaps 3 seconds standing in that elevator, I imagined returning upstairs. I imagined walking into Claire's room. I imagined telling Patricia that Ethan had never supported me. I imagined telling Claire exactly what I owned. Most of all, I imagined looking at Ethan and saying, "You want me out of your life. Let's see how that works when your career depends on my signature." Then the elevator doors opened, and the feeling disappeared. Thomas would have hated that version of me. More importantly, I would have hated her too. I walked through the lobby and out into the morning. The parking lot was washed in pale sunlight. I made it to my Toyota. I put the blanket carefully on the passenger seat. Then I closed the door and sat behind the wheel. I didn't start the engine. For 9 years I had believed the hardest crying of my life had ended at Thomas's funeral. I was wrong. I bent forward until my forehead rested against the steering wheel and cried so hard my chest hurt. I cried because Thomas wasn't there. I cried because my grandson had been born and I hadn't seen his face. I cried because my son had become someone I didn't recognize. And I cried because part of me still wanted to protect him. That was the most painful realization. Even after what Ethan had done, my mind was already searching for excuses. He's tired. He's scared. Claire just gave birth. Work is stressful. Give him time. Mothers can turn excuses into an art form when the truth hurts too much. Eventually, I sat up. I wiped my face. Then I called Rebecca. She answered immediately. Melissa, everything okay? The Riverside closing is final. Yes. No outstanding contingencies. Nothing material. Grant Community Holdings controls the property as of this morning. I looked through my windshield at the hospital. And Pierce, they'll need to finalize the redevelopment arrangement with us. There are still financing issues. What issues? We'll go through them later. Melissa, you sound upset. I was silent. Rebecca knew me too well. What happened? Ben was born. Oh, Melissa, congratulations. I haven't met him. Another silence. What do you mean? I told her. Not dramatically, just the facts. When I finished, Rebecca said something I didn't expect. What do you want me to do? About what, Riverside? I understood immediately. Nothing. Melissa. Nothing, Rebecca. Pierce is vulnerable. If you want to reconsider, no. My voice was sharper than I intended. I softened it. Ethan's behavior as my son has nothing to do with whether Pierce development receives fair treatment. All right. But there's something else. I'm listening. I stared at the hospital windows. For years, there had been moments when Ethan's path became difficult, and I quietly made it easier. A connection, an investment, a financial cushion. Never enough for him to see my hand. Enough to keep him from falling. I had called it love. Maybe sometimes it was. Maybe sometimes it was fear. What protections are we currently providing Pierce beyond the standard acquisition terms? Rebecca paused. A temporary financing structure from earlier negotiations. We'd discussed extending it. Are we contractually required to? No. Would you recommend extending it if Ethan weren't my son? The silence lasted longer this time. No. That answer settled something inside me. Then don't. Are you sure? Completely. You're withdrawing support? No. I looked at the blanket beside me. I'm withdrawing special protection. Rebecca understood. I won't hurt him, I said. I won't use the company to punish him. I won't interfere with his career. But, I took a breath. But I'm done standing underneath him every time he chooses to jump. For years, Ethan had been walking across bridges he believed he had built himself. He didn't know how many times his mother had quietly reinforced them from underneath. That morning, I decided I would stop. Not because I wanted him to fall. Because if my son was ever going to become the man I had raised him to be, he needed to learn whether he could stand without pretending the people who loved him were beneath him. I started the car. Before pulling away, I touched the folded blanket. Someday, Ben, I whispered, I'll give this to you myself. Then I drove home. Behind me was the hospital where my son had just told me I no longer belonged. Ahead of me was a conference room, where very soon Ethan would discover that the mother he thought needed his help had been quietly protecting him for years. But this time, I wasn't going to save him. I was going to let the truth do what I never could. The signature on the final page. The morning after Ben was born, I woke before 6. For a few seconds lying in the darkness, I didn't remember what had happened. Then I saw the blue gift bag on the chair across from my bed. The blanket was still inside, and everything came back. Ethan standing in the hallway. Claire's family moving freely in and out of the room. My son's relief when I finally agreed to leave. I reached for my phone. Nothing from Ethan. No photograph of Ben. No message asking whether I had arrived home safely. I opened social media even though I knew I shouldn't. Claire had posted a photograph. Benjamin Thomas Grant was asleep against her chest, wrapped in a white hospital blanket. Ethan sat beside her, smiling down at them. The caption said, "Our whole world arrived this morning." I stared at the words. Our whole world. I should have felt only joy. Instead, I wondered whether there was any place left for me in that world. I closed the app. At 8:30, Rebecca called. Are you coming in? Yes. You don't have to. I know. Melissa, you were awake all night. So were half the attorneys working on Riverside. Attorneys get paid to be miserable. That made me smile. I'll be there at 10. Grant Community Holdings occupied 3 floors of a renovated building in downtown Richmond. There was no enormous sign outside, no marble statue of Thomas, no portrait of me hanging in the lobby. That had always been deliberate. Thomas and I built the company to own things, not to advertise ourselves. When I walked through the doors that morning, the receptionist stood. Good morning, Mrs. Grant? Morning, Anna. Nobody there looked twice at my old Toyota. Nobody cared that I was wearing the same navy slacks I had worn to the hospital. They knew exactly who I was. Rebecca was waiting in the conference room with coffee and a stack of documents. She took one look at me. You look terrible. Good morning to you too. I mean that affectionately. I'm sure. She pushed a cup toward me. Drink. Rebecca Lawson had been part of my life for almost 30 years. She had originally been the young attorney Thomas hired when we purchased our 4th apartment property. Thomas liked her because she argued with him. I liked her because she usually had documentation proving why he was wrong. Over time, she became more than our attorney. She became family in the way people sometimes do when they stand beside you through enough important moments. She had been at the hospital when Thomas died. She had helped me restructure the company afterward, and unlike my own son, Rebecca knew precisely what I had spent the last 9 years doing. She sat across from me. Before we discuss Riverside, how are you? I'm functioning. That's not what I asked. It's the answer you're getting. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right. She opened the first folder. Then let's talk business. The documents in front of me represented the end of a journey Thomas and I had begun with a duplex whose upstairs toilet leaked through the kitchen ceiling. People sometimes hear that someone owns millions of dollars in property and imagine a single brilliant decision. There wasn't one. There were thousands of ordinary decisions. We bought that first duplex when interest rates frightened us. Thomas replaced the roof himself because we couldn't afford a contractor. I handled tenant calls while pregnant with Ethan. Our second property had plumbing problems so severe that for 6 months, nearly every dollar of rent went back into repairs. We almost sold. We didn't. Then came a 4-unit building, then 8, then 12. Thomas had a gift for seeing possibility where other people saw deterioration. He would stand in an abandoned building with broken windows and say, "Look at the light in this room." I would stand beside him and say, "Look at the foundation estimate." That was our marriage, dreamer and calculator. Eventually, we stopped doing the repairs ourselves. Then we stopped managing every property ourselves. By the time Ethan went to college, our portfolio included apartment buildings across Central Virginia. Later, we moved into commercial real estate. Thomas became interested in senior housing after watching his own mother struggle to find a place she could afford that still felt dignified. That changed the direction of the company. We learned that property could generate returns without forgetting the people living inside it. After Thomas died, many people assumed I would sell. A few men in our industry assumed I wouldn't know how to continue without him. One even explained one of my own financing structures back to me during a meeting. I let him finish. Then I declined his proposal, quietly. That became my style. I didn't need people to know I was powerful. I needed the contracts to be correct. Over 9 years, Grant Community Holdings grew substantially. We acquired additional residential communities, several commercial buildings and interests in senior housing developments. The company was worth tens of millions. On paper, so was I. But wealth on paper had never changed how I liked my coffee or what car I wanted to drive. It certainly hadn't made Thomas come back, so I kept my life, my house, my Toyota, my grocery coupons, and my privacy. Rebecca slid the Riverside documents toward me. Everything has cleared. I turned through the pages. Riverside Exchange was one of our larger recent acquisitions, but not reckless. The location made sense. The existing leases created stability. Redevelopment offered upside if handled correctly. Pierce Development was one potential partner, not the only one. That distinction was about to become very important. Any changes overnight? I asked. Nothing significant. Seller signatures are complete. Our entity has funded. And Pierce? They've been notified ownership transferred. Do they know our full structure? They know Grant Community Holdings is controlling owner. They don't know you personally control Grant Community Holdings. Good. Rebecca leaned back. Melissa, I want to ask you something before you sign the final acknowledgement. I know what you're going to ask. Humor me. I put down my pen. Go ahead. Do you want Pierce Development removed from consideration? No. You answered quickly. Because the answer hasn't changed. Your son humiliated you yesterday. My son hurt me yesterday. Fine, hurt you. That doesn't make every person at Pierce responsible. True. And it doesn't make their proposal bad. Rebecca nodded. It needs revision, but no, it isn't bad. Then we evaluate it normally. She watched me carefully. What if evaluating it normally hurts Ethan? I thought about that. Then Ethan experiences what every other professional experiences when a proposal isn't good enough. And if Pierce loses the project, then they lose it. You won't intervene. No. Rebecca tapped one finger against the table. And you won't intervene to save them either. There was the real question. No. She nodded slowly. That's different for you. It was. There had been more than one occasion when Ethan's life became difficult, and I quietly softened the landing. He never knew. I told myself anonymity made it harmless. But maybe invisible help could create visible arrogance. Maybe Ethan had started believing every door opened because he was the person turning the handle. Rebecca pushed another document toward me. There's something you should review later. What? Pierce's earlier financing support. I looked at her. The temporary structure. Yes. Something wrong with it? No, but there's more history there than you may remember. I knew immediately she was referring to the support our company had quietly provided months earlier. Tomorrow, I said. Melissa. I know enough for today. She accepted that. I picked up the pen. For a moment I thought about Thomas. If he had been sitting beside me, he would have read the signature page twice, even though 3 attorneys had already checked it. Then he would have whispered, "You sure about this, Mel?" Not because he doubted me, because important decisions deserved one final question. I asked myself that question now. Was I sure about Riverside? Yes. About Ethan? No. But perhaps that was exactly why the two needed to remain separate. I signed. Melissa Grant. My handwriting looked almost disappointingly ordinary beneath a transaction of that size. Rebecca added the date. That's it. That's it. Riverside Exchange is officially under Grant Community Holdings. I sat back. No music, no celebration, just a signature. Yet somewhere else in Richmond, Ethan was probably holding his newborn son, believing his biggest professional opportunity depended on convincing an unknown property owner to support Pierce Development's plans. He had no idea his mother had just signed the final page. Rebecca closed the folder. Want champagne? It's 10:40 in the morning. Thomas would have. Thomas once celebrated a refinancing with gas station hot dogs. He was a complicated man. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had since the hospital. Then Rebecca became serious. Melissa, there's still the question of the support Pierce expects us to extend. I know. We're under no obligation. I know. If we refuse, their financing gets harder. Would you recommend extending it if Ethan worked somewhere else? Rebecca didn't answer. I waited. Finally, she said no. Then there's our answer. She studied me. You really mean it? Yes. I won't punish my son for hurting me. Rebecca's expression softened. But I looked down at my signature. But I'm done rescuing him. Saying it aloud made it real. I had spent years quietly moving obstacles from Ethan's path. No more. Not because I wanted him to fail, because I wanted whatever happened next to belong to him. His success, his mistakes, his consequences, all of it. I stood and gathered my handbag. Rebecca walked me toward the door. Melissa. I turned. Congratulations on your grandson. The words caught me unexpectedly. Thank you. You'll meet him. I hope so. No, you will. I wished I had her certainty. Before leaving, I glanced through the conference room windows at Richmond below. From that height, buildings looked small. Problems did too. But I knew better. A building could contain someone's entire future. A hospital room could contain someone's entire heart. And a signature could change a relationship long before anyone understood what had happened. Ethan still believed I was sitting at home waiting for him to call. He didn't know I had spent the morning taking control of Riverside Exchange. He didn't know I had just refused to give his company special protection. And he certainly didn't know that this wasn't the first time my invisible hand had been beneath his career. That truth was still buried in Rebecca's other folder. Soon I would have to open it. And when I did I would be forced to admit just how many times I had mistaken rescuing my son for loving him. The favor Ethan never knew about. The folder Rebecca had mentioned stayed on my mind all night. I tried not to let it. I made dinner, watered the plants on my back porch, and watched half of a television program without remembering a single thing that happened. Every few minutes I checked my phone. Nothing from Ethan. No picture of Ben. No message. I hated myself a little for checking. By the following morning, I decided that waiting for my son to remember I existed was not how I intended to spend another day. So I drove downtown. Rebecca was already in her office when I arrived. "You came for the Pierce file," she said. "I came for coffee." She raised an eyebrow. "And the Pierce file." "Thought so." 10 minutes later, we were sitting at the same conference table where I had signed the Riverside documents. Rebecca placed a gray folder in front of me. Pierce Development Group. I opened it. The first pages were familiar. 6 months earlier, Pierce Development had begun positioning itself for the Riverside redevelopment before the previous owner had formally decided to sell. Jonathan Pierce's plan was ambitious. Retail space on the ground level, professional offices, upscale apartments, restaurants overlooking the river. The projections were attractive, perhaps too attractive. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention to the individual executives involved. Grant Community Holdings evaluated dozens of proposals each year. I knew Ethan worked for Jonathan, but I had not realized how deeply he was tied to Riverside. Rebecca tapped a page. This is where the problem started. I read the memo. One of Pierce's primary investors had become concerned about rising construction costs and threatened to withdraw. Without that investor, Pierce would have struggled to demonstrate enough committed capital to keep the redevelopment negotiations alive. "What did Jonathan do?" I asked. "He looked for bridge support." I remembered now, not the details, the decision. One of our affiliated investment entities had provided a temporary guarantee that gave Pierce enough credibility to keep negotiations moving. At the time, Rebecca had presented it to me as a relatively low-risk opportunity with favorable protections. I had approved it. I turned another page. Then I saw Ethan's name. Lead Development Manager Ethan Grant. I looked up. "I approved this after you knew Ethan was involved." Rebecca nodded. "You knew he was on the project. I'm not sure you understood how central his role had become." I tried to remember the conversation. Claire had been 4 months pregnant. Ethan had seemed exhausted. He had mentioned a major project that could determine whether he advanced at Pierce. I remembered asking Rebecca whether the guarantee made sense without considering Ethan. She had said yes under the terms we negotiated, so I approved it, but there had been something else. "Didn't I ask you to make sure Pierce wasn't told I was behind it?" "You did." "Why?" "You said you didn't want Ethan thinking his mother had saved his project." I leaned back. There it was. Even then, I had known exactly what I was doing, protecting him without allowing him to know he needed protection. Rebecca slid another document toward me. This guarantee didn't save Pierce permanently. It bought them time. How much? Enough to keep the original investor from walking immediately, and enough for Jonathan to secure additional commitments. And Ethan. He probably believes Jonathan solved the problem. I remembered a dinner at Ethan's house shortly afterward. He had been unusually cheerful. Riverside had apparently survived some internal crisis, though he never explained it clearly. Jonathan had worked his magic, Ethan said. Claire had poured champagne. Patricia and Richard were there. I could still hear Richard telling Ethan, "That's what happens when you work with serious people." Serious people. I had been sitting 6 feet away eating roasted chicken. Nobody knew one of those serious people was me. At the time, I had found it almost amusing. Now I didn't. "How much did our guarantee matter?" I asked. Rebecca folded her hands. "Do you want the polite answer or the real one?" "The real one. Without it, there's a good chance the investor would have withdrawn. And then, Pierce probably loses its preferred position. Ethan's project dies. Possibly." I looked down at his name. For months, my son had believed his professional success came entirely from his own ability. And to be fair, much of it did. Ethan was intelligent. He worked hard. I would never take that away from him. But there was a difference between earning success and believing nobody had ever helped you reach it. I thought about the hospital. Patricia telling Ethan he had enough responsibility without supporting me. Ethan answering, "She doesn't really have anyone else." The memory made my face warm. While he was allowing people to believe he carried me, I had quietly been carrying part of the financial structure beneath his most important project. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. Rebecca watched me. "You're angry." "I'm trying not to be." "Why?" "Because anger makes people stupid. Sometimes it makes them honest." I smiled faintly. "That's why I pay you." "No, you pay me because Thomas once tried to buy an apartment building without reading an environmental report. He said the seller seemed trustworthy. The seller had 3 lawsuits. I remember." We both smiled. Then the room became quiet again. Rebecca turned to another section. "This is what matters now." The temporary guarantee was nearing its end. Pierce had expected that once Riverside transferred to the new owner, Grant Community Holdings might extend a modified version of the support. Not because we had promised, because it would make their redevelopment proposal easier to finance. "Are we obligated to renew anything?" I asked. "No." "Have we implied that we will mow?" "No." "Would extending it improve our return?" "Potentially." "Potentially isn't an answer." Rebecca nodded. "It would also increase our exposure while Pierce is still relying on optimistic assumptions, construction costs, among other things." "Then why are we considering it?" "Because Jonathan wants the deal." "That's not my problem." "And because until 2 days ago you were inclined to give them more flexibility." That stopped me. "Because of Ethan." Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't need to. I stood and walked toward the windows. Below us, traffic moved along the street in neat lines. I thought I was helping him. "You were." "Was I?" "Melissa." "No, think about it." I turned toward her. Every time Ethan got close to a hard landing, I found a way to put something underneath him. "Not every time." "Enough. You paid for college. Parents do that when they can. You helped with his first house. Thomas wanted to. You helped Pierce." "Without telling Ethan." Rebecca nodded. "Yes. And now look at him." "Don't blame yourself for what happened at the hospital." "I'm not." But part of me was asking a harder question. Had I made it easier for Ethan to become the man who stood in that hallway? When success came, he believed it proved his superiority. When money appeared, he believed he had created it. When a professional crisis disappeared, he assumed someone had recognized his brilliance. And whenever his mother seemed ordinary beside the people he wanted to impress, he allowed himself to feel embarrassed. Maybe I hadn't caused that. But perhaps I had protected him from enough consequences that he never learned humility. I returned to the table. "What happens if we don't extend the guarantee?" "Pierce has options." "Meaning?" "They can bring in more equity, reduce the scope, improve their projections, negotiate different financing." Maybe I hadn't caused that. But perhaps I had protected him from enough consequences that he never learned humility. I returned to the table. What happens if we don't extend the guarantee? Pierce has options. Meaning, they can bring in more equity, reduce the scope, improve their projections, negotiate different financing, or accept less favorable terms. So the project doesn't automatically fail. No. Ethan doesn't automatically lose his job. No. Nobody gets punished. No. I nodded. Then we don't extend it. Rebecca studied me carefully. Because he threw you out of the hospital. No. Be certain. I am. I placed my hand on the folder. If Ethan had welcomed me into that room, would you recommend this guarantee on purely financial grounds? Rebecca considered the question. No. Then there's nothing else to discuss. All right. I don't want anyone at Pierce treated differently because Ethan is my son. They won't be. That means no retaliation. Of course. And no favors. Rebecca nodded. No favors. Those two words felt heavier than I expected. For years I had thought love meant making life easier for the people I cared about. Thomas had understood something I was only beginning to learn. Sometimes love means allowing someone to carry the weight of their own choices. I closed the folder. Does Jonathan know who controls Grant Community Holdings? He knows the corporate structure. He doesn't know much about you personally. And Ethan? Almost certainly nothing. Keep it that way. For now. For as long as it's professionally appropriate. Rebecca leaned back. You know this will come out eventually. I know. How do you think he'll react? I thought about Ethan's face when he believed I needed his $500 for a water heater. Then I imagined him discovering the woman he had described as dependent had signed the documents controlling Riverside Exchange. I have no idea. That was the truth. I left the office shortly before noon. On the way home, I stopped at a grocery store. For the first time since Ben's birth, I walked past the baby aisle without stopping. At home, there was still no message from Ethan. But later that afternoon, my phone rang. For one hopeful second, I thought it was him. It was Rebecca. Pierce contacted us. Already. Jonathan wants a meeting regarding the financing support. When? Not immediately. His team is revising the numbers first. Good. There's something else. What? Ethan is apparently leading the revised presentation. I closed my eyes. Of course he was. Then evaluate it like any other presentation. I will. After we hung up, I went upstairs. The blanket was still in the gift bag. I took it out and spread it across the bed. My fingers moved over one blue square cut from Thomas's shirt. I hope I'm doing this right, I whispered. Thomas wasn't there to answer, but I could almost hear what he would have said. Let the boy stand on his own feet, Mel. So that was what I decided to do. I wasn't closing doors. I wasn't taking anything away that Ethan had earned. I wasn't destroying his career. I was simply stepping out from underneath it. For the first time in years, whatever happened next at Riverside would depend on Ethan Jonathan and the strength of their own decisions. No invisible mother, no secret guarantee, no quiet rescue. And somewhere across Richmond, my son was preparing to fight for the biggest project of his career. He believed he needed to convince a mysterious new owner. He had no idea he had spent years sitting across dinner tables from her. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks passed before I understood that silence could become a routine. Every morning I woke around 6. I made coffee. I opened the blinds in the kitchen. I checked my phone. And every morning Ethan's name was absent. At first I told myself he was exhausted. New parents barely slept. Claire was recovering. Ben needed them. Ethan had Riverside hanging over his head. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. By the end of the first week, I stopped believing them. It takes less than 30 seconds to send a photograph. Less than 10 to write Mom, we're okay. Ethan wasn't too busy. He was choosing silence because silence was easier than confronting what had happened at the hospital. And for once, I refused to make it easier for him. I didn't call. That was harder than I expected. Twice during the first week, I picked up the phone and found Ethan's contact. Both times my thumb hovered over his name. Both times I put the phone down. Not because I wanted to punish him, because I had spent too many years teaching my son that no matter how far he pulled away, I would be the one who crossed the distance. This time, the distance belonged to him. Unfortunately, social media made keeping that boundary painful. Claire posted photographs constantly. Ben sleeping against her chest. Ben wearing a tiny blue cap. Ethan holding him beside a window. A photograph of Patricia smiling with my grandson in her arms appeared on the fourth day. The caption said, "Grandma time." I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I closed the app. I had not yet held him. I didn't even know what he smelled like. That may sound like a strange thing to say, but mothers and grandmothers will understand. Babies have a smell that photographs cannot give you. Warm skin, milk, clean blankets, something new, something impossible to describe. I wanted that. I wanted to feel the weight of Ben against my chest. I wanted to whisper Thomas's name to him and tell him about the grandfather whose middle name he carried. But I refused to beg for the privilege. On the 8th day, I took the unfinished emotional energy I had been pouring into waiting and carried it somewhere else. Grant Community Holdings had a senior housing project under renovation outside Richmond. I hadn't planned to visit until later that month, but I called the project manager and asked whether I could come. The property had once been an outdated apartment complex. We were converting it into 72 affordable units designed for older residents who could still live independently, but needed accessible features. When I arrived, workers were installing handrails in one of the corridors. The project manager, Marcus, met me in a hard hat. "Didn't expect to see you today, Mrs. Grant." Neither did I. He handed me a spare helmet. For 2 hours, we walked through apartments. I checked kitchens, door widths, bathroom layouts, emergency systems. In one unit, I noticed the planned kitchen shelving was too high. "Who approved that?" Marcus checked his tablet. "It's standard." "Standard for whom?" He looked at me. I pointed upward. "I'm 5'5". If I'm 78 with arthritis, how am I reaching that top shelf?" He smiled. "I'll have design review it." "Don't review it, lower it." "Yes, ma'am." That afternoon I felt useful in a way I had forgotten. Not powerful, useful. There is a difference. For 3 weeks I stopped arranging my days around the possibility that Ethan might remember me. I had lunch with an old friend. I attended a community housing meeting. I spent an afternoon reviewing scholarship proposals from a local nonprofit we supported. I even replaced the broken hinge on my kitchen cabinet myself, mostly because Thomas would have complained about the way I did it. Every night, though, the house became quiet. That was when I thought about Ben. The blanket remained upstairs. I still hadn't put it away. On the 15th day, Rebecca came over for dinner. She brought Thai food and a bottle of wine. "You look better," she said. "That's a dangerous way to greet a woman." "You know what I mean." "I do." We ate at the kitchen table. Rebecca didn't mention Ethan until we were halfway through dinner. "Pierce is struggling with the revised Riverside structure." I set down my fork. "Business struggling or Ethan struggling?" "Both." "Tell me about the business." That distinction mattered. Rebecca nodded. "Without the extended guarantee, their lenders want more equity. Jonathan's trying to restructure." "Reasonable." "They've also been forced to revisit construction assumptions." "Also reasonable." "The original projections were too optimistic." "I know." Rebecca took a sip of wine. "Ethan apparently wrote part of them." I felt the old instinct immediately. Concern. What would happen to him? Was his job safe? Could I help? I let the questions pass through me without acting on them. "What does Jonathan think?" "He hasn't blamed Ethan publicly, but he wants the revised presentation to be airtight." When is it?" "Probably next week." "With us?" "Yes." I nodded. Rebecca studied me. "You aren't going to ask me to make it easier." "No. You're learning." "Don't sound so pleased." She smiled. The next morning across Richmond, Ethan was learning something too. I didn't know the details until later, but Jonathan Pierce had called his senior team into a conference room and delivered news nobody wanted to hear. Grant Community Holdings would not extend the temporary financial support. If Pierce wanted Riverside, they would need to prove the redevelopment worked without special protection. Ethan took the news personally. Why did they change direction? He asked. Jonathan reportedly replied, They didn't change anything. We assumed. That word mattered. Assumed. Ethan had built much of his life on assumptions. He assumed Riverside financing would work. He assumed his income would continue climbing. He assumed the bonus would arrive. He assumed I needed him. And he assumed that after he sent me away from the hospital, I would eventually call and make peace for him. For once, assumptions were becoming expensive. At home, Claire was beginning to feel it too. The bonus Ethan had expected from Riverside was already part of their plans. They had scheduled landscaping work. Claire wanted to replace her SUV. There were discussions about hiring part-time help when she returned to work. None of those things were catastrophic individually. Together, they reflected a life built with almost no margin. One evening, Ethan finally called me. Or at least I thought he did. My phone rang while I was reading. His name appeared. My heart jumped so quickly that I hated myself for it. I answered. Hello? There was silence. Then the call disconnected. I stared at the screen. He had either called accidentally or lost his nerve. I waited. He didn't call back. I didn't either. The next day, Rebecca sent me the preliminary agenda for the Riverside meeting. Pierce Development Group, Jonathan Pierce, CEO, Ethan Grant, Lead Development Manager, 3 other executives. On our side were Rebecca, our Chief Investment Officer, 2 development specialists, and me. I called Rebecca. Does Pierce know I'll be attending? They know the chairwoman may attend. Do they have my name? It's on the corporate materials if they look deeply enough. Has Ethan? Apparently not. I sat back. It was almost unbelievable. My son had spent months working on a project involving a company bearing his own last name and had never bothered to investigate who controlled it. But Grant wasn't an uncommon name, and Ethan had spent his entire life believing his father's business had been modest and largely dissolved after his death. He had no reason to connect it to me, unless he became curious. And curiosity had never been Ethan's strongest quality when he thought he already knew the answer. That Friday, Claire posted another photograph. Patricia was holding Ben again. I felt the familiar ache. This time, however, I didn't close the app immediately. I looked at my grandson's face. He had Ethan's chin. Thomas's, too. Hello, sweetheart, I whispered. Then I put the phone away and returned to the Riverside documents. For the first time, I read Ethan's revised projections myself. They were better than the originals, more conservative, more realistic. He had done good work. That pleased me. It also made what I was about to do easier. I wouldn't reject him because he had hurt me. I wouldn't approve him because he was my son. I would listen. I would evaluate. And Ethan would finally have to stand on the quality of his own work. 3 days before the meeting, Jonathan's office confirmed attendance. Rebecca called me afterward. Everything set. Good. Still planning to attend? Absolutely. She hesitated. Melissa, when Ethan sees you. I know. You could tell him beforehand. I looked toward the empty chair where Thomas used to sit. No. Why? Because if I call him now, he'll think this is personal. Isn't it? Not in that room. That was the line I intended to protect. Whatever happened between Ethan and me as mother and son, Riverside was business. But I also knew something neither of us could avoid anymore. The moment Ethan walked into that conference room and saw me sitting at the head of the table, the story he had told himself about his mother would collapse. The dependent widow, the woman he helped financially, the grandmother who could be told to wait outside, all of it. For 3 weeks, Ethan had chosen silence because he didn't want to face what he had done. Now he was preparing a presentation that could determine his professional future. And at the end of the table would be the one person he never imagined he would have to convince. The woman at the end of the table. The morning of the Riverside meeting. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. For several minutes I lay still and listened to the quiet house. 9 years earlier, Thomas would have been downstairs already making coffee strong enough to wake the neighbors and pretending he wasn't nervous. He always became energetic before important negotiations. I became quiet. That morning, I needed the quiet. I showered, dressed in a charcoal suit I had owned for several years, and stood in front of the mirror. Nothing dramatic, no expensive jewelry, no attempt to transform myself into the woman Ethan didn't know. I wore my wedding ring and a small pair of pearl earrings Thomas had given me for our 30th anniversary. Then I went downstairs. The blue blanket was still folded in the spare bedroom. I didn't look at it. Today was not about the hospital. I repeated that to myself twice. At 9:15 I arrived at Grant Community Holdings. Rebecca was waiting upstairs. "You look calm," she said. "I'm pretending. You're good at it. 30 years of negotiating with your invoices." She smiled. Then her expression became serious. "Pierce's team is downstairs." "Is Ethan with them?" "Yes." My stomach tightened. Not because I doubted the business decision. Because beneath every title I carried, I was still his mother. "Does he know?" "No." "All right." Rebecca touched my arm. "We can delay." "No." "Melissa, if I delay because Ethan is my son, then I'm doing exactly what I promised I wouldn't do." She nodded. "Business. Business." I entered through a side door into an adjoining office while the Pierce team was escorted into the main conference room. Through the glass partition I could see them without being obvious. Jonathan Pierce entered first. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, confident in the way successful men often become after enough rooms have welcomed them. Ethan walked behind him. My breath caught. He looked tired. Not hospital tired. Something deeper. His suit was immaculate, but I could see tension in his shoulders. He placed his laptop on the table and began arranging documents. 3 weeks. That was the first time I had seen my son in 3 weeks. My instinct was immediate. Go to him. Ask about Ben. Ask whether Claire was sleeping. Ask whether Ethan was eating properly. Motherhood does not disappear simply because someone hurts you. Sometimes it becomes the hardest instinct not to obey. Rebecca leaned toward me. "Ready." "No." "Good enough." We entered. Several people stood. Jonathan turned toward us. "Rebecca." Then his eyes moved to me. "Mrs. Grant." We had met briefly at industry events, but Jonathan had never understood the extent of my ownership. "Mr. Pierce." Ethan was looking down at his laptop. Then he heard my voice. His head came up. The expression on his face changed so completely that for a second nobody else mattered. Confusion first, then surprise, then something close to alarm. "Mom." The room became silent. Jonathan looked from Ethan to me. "You two know each other." I placed my folder on the table. "Ethan is my son." Jonathan blinked. Rebecca smoothly stepped forward. "Before we begin, I think formal introductions might help." She introduced our chief investment officer, our development director, our outside financial consultant. Then she reached me. "And Melissa Grant, chairwoman and majority owner of Grant Community Holdings." I watched the words reach Ethan, not all at once. His eyes moved toward Rebecca, then toward the company logo on the wall, then back to me. "Grant Community Holdings, Grant." He stared at the name as though seeing it for the first time. "Majority owner," he said. His voice was barely audible. I held his gaze. "Yes." Jonathan recovered before Ethan did. "Well," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware of the family connection." "It hasn't been relevant to our evaluation," I said. Ethan was still staring. "Mom, what is this?" Jonathan glanced at him. "Ethan." That one word reminded him where we were. My son sat down. So did everyone else. I took the seat at the end of the table. For the next few minutes, Ethan barely looked at his presentation. Jonathan opened. He explained Pierce's revised redevelopment strategy. Their financial officer reviewed capital commitments. Then Ethan's turn came. He stood. I could see his hand tighten around the presentation remote. For a moment I wondered whether he could continue. Then something in him shifted. Professional training took over. "Thank you," he began. "The revised Riverside plan is based on 3 changes from our original proposal." His voice steadied. He explained them. Reduced construction exposure, phased residential development, more conservative lease assumptions. I listened. Really listened. Not as his mother. as the person responsible for deciding whether his proposal made sense. And to my surprise, Ethan was good. Very good. His revised projections acknowledged weaknesses the earlier version had ignored. He answered questions directly. When our chief investment officer challenged his assumptions about occupancy, Ethan didn't become defensive. He adjusted. For almost 40 minutes, I saw the man Thomas and I had hoped our son would become: prepared, intelligent, hardworking. Then one of our executives asked the question everyone knew was coming. Your returns still assume financing costs below what lenders are currently offering, Pierce. Jonathan leaned forward. We're expecting flexibility based on the temporary support structure already in place. I saw Ethan glance at me. He knew enough now to understand. Our chief investment officer responded, that guarantee expires under its existing terms. Jonathan nodded. We'd like to discuss extending it. On what basis? I asked. It was the first substantive question I had directed at them. Ethan's eyes met mine. Jonathan answered, the project creates significant upside for both sides. So would several competing proposals. True, but Pierce has already invested substantial resources. That's Pierce's sunk costs, not ours. Jonathan smiled slightly. Fair point. Ethan looked almost stunned. Perhaps this was the first time he had heard me speak in a negotiation. At home, I was Mom, the woman who made pot roast, the woman who asked whether he'd taken an umbrella. He had never seen this part of me. Jonathan continued, we believe an extension would stabilize the capital stack. I turned toward Ethan. Do you? The room became very still. He swallowed. The extension would help. That wasn't my question. He understood. Do I think the project requires it? Yes. Ethan glanced at his numbers. Then he surprised me. No. Jonathan turned toward him. Ethan, my son continued, it would make the financing easier, but if we reduce Phase 1 scope another 8% and bring in additional equity, we can proceed without the guarantee. Our financial consultant nodded. At a lower projected return. Yes. But with less leverage. Yes. I watched him. That answer probably cost him politically inside Pierce, but it was honest. Thank you, I said. The meeting continued. No special favors were granted. No threats were made. No revenge was delivered. Pierce would submit revised terms. We would compare them with alternatives. That was all. But for Ethan, nothing was normal anymore. When the meeting ended, Jonathan shook my hand. We appreciate the consideration, Mrs. Grant. Thank you for coming. Then he turned to Ethan. I'll see you downstairs. It wasn't an invitation. It was an escape. Within 2 minutes, everyone had left except Rebecca, Ethan, and me. Rebecca gathered her papers. I'll give you some privacy. The door closed behind her. Ethan remained standing. I stayed seated. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, how much? I knew what he meant. How much what? How much is this company worth? That's your first question. His face reddened. No, I don't know. I don't even know what my first question is. He began pacing. You own Riverside. Grant Community Holdings owns Riverside. And you own Grant Community Holdings. I control it. Since when? Long before you knew Riverside existed. He stopped. What happened to Dad's business? I looked at him. This is your father's business. Ethan stared at me. No. Yes. He did small property deals. He started with small property deals. And after he died? I continued. Continued what? Building it. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You're telling me you've been running a company worth what, 10 million, 20? I didn't answer. His expression changed. More. This isn't about the number. Of course it's about the number. His voice rose. Then he caught himself. I remained calm. Ethan turned toward the window. His mind was moving backward through his entire life. I could see it happening. College, he said suddenly. What about it? You and Dad told me you'd saved. We had. My first house. A gift. The account Dad left. Partly structured through family assets. He turned. And Riverside. I said nothing. His eyes narrowed. that guarantee. I could almost see another piece fall into place. Was that you? It came through one of our affiliated entities. Ethan sat down slowly. Oh my God. For years, he had believed invisible hands were luck, timing, Jonathan's connections, his own brilliance. Now he was realizing at least one of those hands had belonged to the woman whose old Toyota embarrassed his wife. I thought I was helping you, he whispered. I knew exactly what he meant. The dinners, the groceries, the $500 for my water heater. I could have laughed. I didn't. You were trying to help me. You let me. Yes. You let me tell people I was supporting you. My expression changed. I never asked you to tell anyone that. He looked down. He remembered Patricia. I knew he did. Then he looked back at me. Something defensive entered his face. Why didn't you tell me? There it was. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I shouldn't have treated you that way. Why didn't you tell me? As if the greatest betrayal in the room belonged to me. I stood. We shouldn't do this here. No, I think we should. Ethan. All these years, Mom, you let me think you were struggling. I never told you I was struggling. You knew what I thought. Yes. And you said nothing. Yes. Why? I picked up my handbag. Because I wanted to know something. What? I looked at my son. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood outside a hospital room and decided I wasn't immediate family. Now he knew I controlled a company that could affect the most important project of his career. And suddenly, for the first time in weeks, he couldn't stop looking at me. I wanted to know whether who I was would be enough, I said. His anger disappeared for a moment. I continued. Not what I owned. Not what I could give you. Me. Mom. You gave me your answer at the hospital. His face went pale. Neither of us spoke. Outside the conference room, Richmond continued moving beneath the windows. Finally, Ethan whispered, Why didn't you tell me? This time it didn't sound angry. It sounded wounded. I looked at him and realized the next conversation would be harder than the meeting we had just survived. Because Riverside had only revealed my money. Now Ethan and I would have to talk about what that money had revealed about him. Why didn't you tell me? For several seconds after Ethan asked the question, neither of us moved. Why didn't you tell me? The conference room suddenly felt too small. I had imagined this moment before. Not this exact room, perhaps, and certainly not under these circumstances. But over the years I had wondered how Ethan would react when he eventually learned the truth. I had imagined surprise, maybe laughter, maybe disbelief followed by 1,000 questions about Thomas. I had never imagined anger, yet anger was what I saw first. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down again. So my whole life you've been lying to me. No. He looked up sharply. You let me believe Dad left you with almost nothing. I never said that. You knew I believed it. That's different. Is it? Yes. He stood again. You watched me worry about you. I did. You let me pay for dinners. Yes. You took that money for the water heater. I almost smiled at the absurdity of that particular accusation. I still have it. What? The $500. He stared at me. I put it in an envelope in my desk. Why? Because you were trying to do something kind. He laughed bitterly. Apparently I was an idiot. No. You were my son trying to help his mother, who didn't need help. That doesn't make the intention meaningless. He turned away. I could see embarrassment fighting with anger. That combination is dangerous, because embarrassment wants somewhere else to live. It often becomes blame. Ethan looked through the windows toward downtown Richmond. How much are you worth? I told you, that's not the important question. It's pretty important to me. Why? He turned. Because you're my mother. And my balance sheet changes that. Stop doing that. Doing what? Turning everything around. I'm asking you a question. He shook his head. This is unbelievable. I remained quiet. Eventually he sat again. This time some of the anger had drained out of him. What happened after Dad died? I told you, I continued the business. By yourself. Not literally. We had employees, advisors, Rebecca, eventually a larger executive team. But you ran it? Yes. Why did I never see you doing that? I thought about the question. You did. His brow furrowed. When? Every time you came by and I told you I had paperwork. You said you were helping with investments. I was. Mom. What did you expect? A hard hat and a helicopter. That almost made him smile. Almost. I softened my voice. Your father and I never wanted money to become the center of our family. So you hid it. We kept our business private. From your own son. Especially from our son. That hurt him. I could see it. Why especially me? Because we wanted you to build something of your own. I did. Yes, Ethan, you did. He looked surprised. I continued. You earned your degree. You built your career. You worked long hours. I have never denied any of that. But you helped. Yes. Without telling me. Sometimes. His jaw tightened again. That's manipulation. The word stung. Maybe because there was enough truth in it to make me uncomfortable. I won't pretend every decision I made was perfect. That's convenient. No, it's honest. I sat across from him. After your father died, I became more protective of you. I didn't need protecting. I know that now. He looked away. I thought of the gray folder Rebecca had shown me. Do you remember when Riverside nearly lost its investors 6 months ago? His eyes returned to mine. Yes. What did Jonathan tell you? That he had secured temporary backing. From one of our affiliated entities. His face tightened. So that really was you. I approved it. Because of me. Partly. He pushed his chair backward. Jesus, Mom. Rebecca believed the deal was financially defensible. But would you have done it if I weren't involved? I hesitated. That hesitation answered him. He stood and walked toward the window. So even my biggest project wasn't mine. That's not what I said. It feels like it. Then you're hearing what your pride wants you to hear. He turned sharply. What does that mean? It means help does not erase effort. I leaned forward. Your father and I helped pay for your education. Does that mean you didn't study? No. We helped you with your first home. Does that mean you didn't make mortgage payments? No. Our company helped stabilize Riverside. Does that mean you didn't spend hundreds of hours working on the project? No. Then stop turning gratitude into humiliation. He stared at me. I could tell nobody had ever spoken to him that way. Perhaps I should have sooner. His voice dropped. Why did you stop this guarantee? There it was, the question I had expected. Because Rebecca didn't recommend extending it. That's all. That's all. Nothing to do with the hospital. Nothing. He searched my face. You expect me to believe that, yes. You were thrown out of the hospital and the next day my project loses financial support from your company. When you say it that way, it sounds suspicious. Because it is. Then ask the correct question. What question? Would Grant Community Holdings extend that guarantee if Ethan Grant worked for another company? He said nothing. The answer is no. I continued. If I extended it because you're my son, that would be exactly the kind of interference you're accusing me of. He looked down. So what happens now? Pierce revises the proposal. And if we can't, then another developer may get Riverside. His eyes hardened. You'd let that happen. Yes. Even if it costs me my job. If your job depends on your mother giving your employer a financial concession she wouldn't give anyone else, then I would suggest you have a larger problem. He flinched. I hated causing that pain. But I didn't take the words back. Ethan paced once around the table. Then he stopped. Does Claire know? No. Her parents? No. Anyone in the family? No. He gave a short, humorless laugh. This is going to be unbelievable. Something in his tone bothered me. Why? Claire thinks. He stopped. I know what Claire thinks. He looked embarrassed. I thought about Patricia in the hospital corridor. She thinks you're dependent on me. You allowed her to think that. His face reddened. I didn't exactly say. She said you were helping me financially. He froze. You heard that? Every word. The room became completely silent. I repeated his sentence. She doesn't really have anyone else. Ethan closed his eyes. Mom. Was that easier than telling her the truth? I didn't know the truth. You knew I wasn't helpless. He sat down. For the first time since the meeting ended, he looked smaller. Not financially, humanly. I'm sorry you heard that. Would you be sorry if I hadn't? He didn't answer. I let the silence remain. Then I asked the question that had been sitting inside me since the hospital. If you had known who owned Riverside before Ben was born, would you have sent me away? Ethan looked at me. What? If you'd known about the company, the properties, the money. That's not fair. It's a simple question. You think I threw you out because I thought you were poor? I think you found it easier to dismiss me because you believed there was nothing about me your new world needed. That's not true. Then answer. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. His silence became unbearable. Finally, I nodded. That's what I thought. Mom, I don't know what I would have done. Exactly. He looked wounded. I was too. That was the tragedy of the conversation. Neither of us was winning. I loved you before I knew any of this, he said. I know. Then why are you acting like I didn't? Because loving someone and respecting them aren't always the same thing. His eyes dropped. I continued more gently. I never needed you to admire me, Ethan. I didn't need you to know what I owned. I needed you to believe I had value when you thought I owned nothing. He rubbed both hands over his face. I messed up. It was the first honest thing he had said about the hospital. Yes. He looked up, perhaps expecting me to soften it. I didn't. But messing up doesn't make you irredeemable. He swallowed. What do you want from me? Nothing. That's not an answer. It is. I stood. I don't want your money. I don't want a performance. I don't want you bringing Ben to my house because you suddenly know I'm wealthy. His face changed. I wouldn't do that. I hope not. Then what? I want you to decide what kind of man you want your son to grow up watching. That landed. I could see it. Ben had changed the meaning of everything. Ethan was no longer only my son. He was someone's father. I picked up my handbag. What happens with Riverside? He asked. Exactly what should happen. Meaning, your company submits its revised proposal. Our team evaluates it against the alternatives. No special treatment. No. He looked at me. No punishment either. No. Even after what I did. Especially after what you did. He didn't understand, so I explained. If I use money to hurt you because you hurt me, then money becomes exactly what your father and I never wanted it to become. A weapon. Yes. He looked down. I walked toward the door. Mom. I stopped. Are you ever going to forgive me? My hand rested on the door handle. I don't know. His face fell. But I hope so. I opened the door. Forgiveness isn't the same as pretending something didn't happen. He nodded. And trust, that takes longer. I left him alone in the conference room. Rebecca was waiting near her office but didn't ask what had happened. She only looked at me. Coffee. Something stronger. It's 11:30. I know. That made her smile. As we walked away, I glanced once through the glass wall. Ethan was still sitting alone. For the first time in his life, my son knew exactly what his mother possessed. But I wasn't sure he yet understood the far more important thing he had almost lost. Me. And across town, Claire was about to discover the truth, too. I wondered which part would matter most to her. That the mother-in-law she had kept outside her hospital room was not dependent on Ethan at all. Or that the woman she had dismissed as an inconvenient old widow controlled enough wealth to change the future Claire had carefully planned. I wouldn't have to wait long to find out. Claire came to my door. 2 days after the Riverside meeting, my doorbell rang at 10:17 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a contractor's proposal when the sound startled me. Nobody had called first. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Ethan. I closed the folder and walked toward the front door. When I looked through the glass, my heart stopped. Claire was standing on my porch, and in her arms was Ben. I didn't move. 3 weeks of photographs had not prepared me for the sight of my grandson only a few feet away. He wore a pale blue sleeper and a little white cap. His face was turned against Claire's chest, one tiny fist tucked beneath his chin. Claire saw me through the glass. "Melissa." I opened the door. "Hi." Her voice sounded uncertain. That was unusual for Claire. "Hi." I probably should have called. Probably. She glanced down at Ben. "I thought maybe you might want to see him." Might want to. I gripped the edge of the door. "Come in." Claire stepped into the hallway. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do. She looked around my house differently than she ever had before. I noticed it immediately. The same living room, same furniture, same family photographs, same old hardwood floors Thomas and I had refinished ourselves. But now Claire knew the woman living there could afford almost any house in Richmond. Her eyes moved briefly toward the staircase, then back to me. "Would you like to hold him?" Every thought disappeared. Yes. One word. That was all I could manage. Claire carefully placed Ben into my arms. The moment his weight settled against me, something inside my chest opened. He was so small, smaller than he had looked in photographs. Warm, soft, real. I looked down at his face. His nose was Claire's, but his chin, "Oh," I whispered. "What?" "That's Ethan." Claire smiled. "Everyone says that." "No, I mean Ethan at exactly this age." Ben moved slightly. His tiny mouth opened and closed. Then his fingers curled around mine. I had imagined that moment every day since the hospital. I had imagined anger being part of it. It wasn't. There was only love, immediate, complete, terrifying. "Hello, sweetheart," I whispered. My eyes filled. "I'm your grandmother." Claire looked away, perhaps giving me privacy. I touched Ben's cheek with one finger. "Your middle name belonged to a very good man." My voice broke. "Thomas would have loved you." For several minutes, neither Claire nor I spoke. I carried Ben into the living room and sat in Thomas's old chair, the same chair where he had held Ethan as a baby. That nearly undid me. Claire sat across from me. "I'm sorry." I looked up. She folded her hands. "About the hospital." I waited. I was exhausted and overwhelmed. "I understand that." I wasn't thinking clearly. I looked down at Ben. "Claire, you were the woman who had just given birth. You had every right to decide who entered your room." Relief appeared on her face too quickly. Then I continued. "But Ethan told me not to visit for weeks." Her relief disappeared. "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" She hesitated. "I wanted time to adjust. With your parents. That's different." There it was again. The same phrase Ethan had used. I looked at her. "Why?" "My mother was helping me. So was I." "I know." "Do you?" Claire's eyes dropped. Ben shifted against my chest. I adjusted the blanket around him. "I wasn't trying to take over your child." "I know that now." "Do you?" She looked up. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Guilt, certainly, but also nervousness. "Melissa, Ethan told me everything." There it was. I had known we would eventually reach this part. "Everything is a large word." "About Grant Community Holdings." I nodded. "About Riverside." Another nod. "About Thomas." "All right." Claire gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "I honestly thought Ethan was joking." "I imagine. He said you control the company." "I do. And the company owns Riverside." "Yes." She looked around my living room again. This time I didn't pretend not to notice. "I don't understand." "What part?" "Why do you live here?" I almost smiled. "Because I live here." "But you could live anywhere." "So could many people." "You know what I mean. I like my house." She glanced toward the driveway. "And the Toyota. It works." Claire stared at me. I realized that for someone who had spent years treating wealth as a language, people spoke through objects. I probably made no sense at all. Why didn't Ethan know? That's between Ethan and me. But I'm his wife. Then he can tell you whatever he chooses about our conversation. Claire nodded slowly. Ben made a tiny sound. We both looked at him. For a moment the tension disappeared. Then Claire said, "Ethan told me you helped with Riverside before." I didn't respond. The guarantee. Grant Community Holdings approved a temporary financial structure. Because Ethan was involved. Partly. Her eyes widened. So you saved the project? No. That's what Ethan said. Then Ethan misunderstood. I kept my voice calm. We provided temporary support under terms that made business sense. Pierce still had to solve its own problems. But now you're refusing to extend it. We are not obligated to extend it. Claire leaned forward. Melissa, Ethan could lose everything he's worked for. There it was. The visit changed. Not dramatically. Claire did not become cruel. She didn't demand money. That would have been easier. Instead, concern began slipping into calculation. Riverside is important to him, she said. I know. Jonathan promised that if this project succeeded, Ethan would be considered for partnership. I know that too. We made decisions based on that. I looked at her. What decisions? She hesitated. The house. Other things. You spent money based on income Ethan hadn't earned yet. Her face tightened. That's not fair. It's not judgment. It's arithmetic. She looked away. I had spent my life around numbers. Numbers didn't care whether the truth embarrassed you. After a moment, Claire said, "If you can help him without hurting yourself, I don't understand why you wouldn't." I looked down at Ben. That sentence was exactly why I had needed boundaries. Do you know why the company isn't extending the guarantee? Because of what happened at the hospital. No. She blinked. Ethan asked the same thing. Then why? Because Rebecca and our financial team don't recommend it under the current structure. But you're the owner, which doesn't make bad risk good risk. Claire sat back. For several seconds she said nothing. Then her eyes moved to Ben. At least we don't have to worry about his future. I felt something inside me become very still. What does that mean? She smiled faintly. Nothing. I just mean, knowing there's family security changes things. Does it? Of course. For whom? She seemed confused. For Ben. I waited. Claire continued. Ethan said Thomas probably created trusts. I said nothing. Did he? There was the question. Not, how can I repair what happened? Not, what does Melissa need from us? A trust. I gently adjusted Ben in my arms. Claire, I'm not discussing my estate planning. Her face reddened. I wasn't asking for myself. I know. I'm talking about your grandson. He's 3 weeks old. Exactly. Parents think about these things. Then you and Ethan should plan for him. She stared at me. You're saying you wouldn't leave anything to Ben? I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying my relationship with my grandson will not begin with a conversation about what he might inherit when I die. The words landed hard. Claire looked genuinely ashamed. That isn't why I came. I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me did. Why did you come? Her eyes filled. Because Ethan told me what you said. What did I say? That you didn't want us bringing Ben here because we suddenly knew you had money. I looked down at my grandson. Claire's voice became quieter. And I realized that's exactly what it would look like. Is that what it is? She took a long time to answer. I don't know. That honesty surprised me. Claire wiped beneath one eye. I wanted to apologize, I really did, but when Ethan told me about the company, I also felt relieved. Why? Because we've been scared. She looked exhausted suddenly. Not polished, not superior, just frightened. We owe more than I thought we did. Ethan kept saying Riverside would fix everything. I closed my eyes briefly. There was the danger. One future success had become the solution to every current mistake. Claire. She looked at me. Ben will always be welcome in my life. Her face softened. So will you if we can build something honest. She nodded. But I will not pay for access to my grandson. I wasn't asking you to. Good. And I won't use my money to make Ethan's consequences disappear. Her mouth tightened. Even if it costs him his career. If Ethan's career survives only because his mother secretly props it up, then it isn't much of a career. She looked hurt. I softened my voice. He is capable, Claire. I watched his presentation. You did? I was good. A small trace of pride appeared in her face. Really? Yes. Then help him. No. The pride disappeared. Why? Because he needs to learn that being capable is enough. He doesn't need me hiding underneath every bridge he crosses. Claire was quiet. I looked at Ben. And neither does he. She followed my gaze. Ben. Someday you'll want to remove every obstacle from his path. She nodded. Of course. Don't. She looked surprised. Protect him from danger. Protect him from cruelty. But don't protect him from every consequence. I smiled sadly. I made that mistake with Ethan. For the first time since arriving, Claire seemed to hear me not as an obstacle or a wealthy mother-in-law, but as another mother. Ben began fussing. Claire stood instinctively. I should feed him. I rose and handed him back. Letting go hurt more than I expected. At the door, Claire paused. Can I bring him again? I looked at her. Because I'm his grandmother. Her eyes dropped. Then she met mine. Because you're his grandmother. Then yes. She nodded. As she walked toward her car, I stood in the doorway, watching Ben disappear into the back seat. My house felt painfully quiet again. But something had changed. I had finally held my grandson, and I had done it without writing a check approving a guarantee or promising an inheritance. For the first time in years, someone in my family had been forced to decide whether they wanted Melissa Grant or Melissa Grant's money. Claire had not fully answered that question yet. Neither had Ethan. But soon they would have fewer places to hide from it. Because Riverside was beginning to expose something far more dangerous than a secret fortune. It was exposing the cost of the life Ethan and Claire had built around money they hadn't earned yet. And that life was about to start coming apart. When everything started falling apart, the first thing Ethan lost was not his house. It was not his car. It was not his job. It was certainty. For years, my son had lived with the quiet confidence that whatever happened next would somehow work out. The next promotion would come. The next deal would close. The next bonus would cover whatever they had already spent. Riverside had become the biggest version of that belief. If Riverside succeeded, Ethan would move closer to partnership. If he became a partner, his income would rise. If his income rose, the house would become affordable again. The cars would make sense. The club membership would become an investment instead of an indulgence. Everything depended on tomorrow becoming profitable enough to justify yesterday. Then tomorrow changed. Pierce Development submitted its revised Riverside proposal 1 week after Claire brought Ben to my house. Our team evaluated it alongside 2 alternatives. I stayed involved but carefully. No private conversations with Ethan. No instructions to our staff about how to treat Pierce. No calls to Jonathan. I wanted the numbers to speak. They did. Pierce's revised proposal was stronger than the original. Ethan had done good work. But without our extended guarantee, the financing costs were higher, and the projected return no longer justified the full redevelopment plan. Our team recommended reducing the first phase. Jonathan didn't like it. Neither did Ethan. But the alternative was losing Riverside entirely. Pierce accepted. That should have been good news. Instead, it changed Ethan's future. Jonathan called him into his office the following Monday. I learned about the conversation later from Ethan himself. Jonathan placed the original Riverside projections on the desk between them. You believed these numbers. Ethan looked at the pages. At the time. That's not what I asked. Ethan understood. Yes. Jonathan tapped the revenue assumptions. And now, no. Why? Because I was building the model around the outcome we wanted. Jonathan nodded. Exactly. That sentence cost Ethan the promotion he had been expecting. He wasn't fired. Jonathan wasn't interested in destroying a talented employee over one overly optimistic project. But partnership disappeared from the immediate conversation. So did the bonus Ethan and Claire had already mentally spent. For the first time, Ethan's professional ambition encountered a consequence that nobody quietly removed. At home, the numbers became even less forgiving. I didn't know the details until later, but their monthly obligations were worse than I had realized. The house had been refinanced. Both vehicles carried payments. Claire had put several large nursery purchases on credit. They had membership fees, travel expenses, landscaping contracts, and countless subscriptions that seemed insignificant individually. Their income was still good. Their margin was not. When the expected Riverside bonus disappeared, so did the illusion. Claire called me 3 days after Jonathan's decision. I was surprised to see her name. Melissa? Yes. Did you know what, about Ethan's bonus? I set down the document I had been reading. I knew Riverside was being reduced. Jonathan told him there won't be a bonus this year. I'm sorry. There was a pause. Are you? I closed my eyes. Claire. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. No, it wasn't, she exhaled. We're just under a lot of pressure. I understand. Do you? That question almost made me laugh. I had spent the first 15 years of my marriage worrying about whether one broken furnace could erase our savings. Yes, I understood pressure. What do you need from me? I asked. The silence that followed told me everything. Finally, she said, nothing. Then why did you call? I don't know. I did. She wanted me to volunteer, to say, don't worry, I'll fix it. For years, that was probably exactly what I would have done. Instead, I said, you and Ethan should sit down with every account, every debt, and every monthly expense. We know what we owe. Knowing the total isn't the same as understanding the structure. Claire was quiet. Make 3 lists, I continued. What you need, what you owe, what you're spending because of the life you think you're supposed to have. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, it's clear. She didn't thank me, but she didn't argue either. A week later, the luxury SUV disappeared from their driveway. Then the country club membership ended. Claire canceled a trip they had planned for the fall. None of those changes destroyed them. That was the interesting part. They simply made them feel exposed. The hardest decision involved the house. Ethan had bought it when his salary first jumped significantly. At the time, the mortgage had been aggressive but manageable. Then came renovations, refinancing, lifestyle inflation. By the time Ben was born, the house had become less of a home and more of a monthly demand. One evening, Ethan and Claire sat at their kitchen island surrounded by statements. Ben slept nearby. Claire held a credit card bill. We shouldn't have to live like this. Ethan looked at her. Like what? Calculating groceries. We're not choosing between groceries and electricity. You know what I mean. No, I don't. She pushed the statement away. Your mother could solve this in 5 minutes. There it was. Ethan stared at her. Don't. Don't what? Bring my mother into this. How can I not? She has more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. That doesn't make it ours. I'm not saying it's ours. Then what are you saying? I'm saying she knows we're struggling. And Claire looked at him as if the answer were obvious. And she could help. Ethan stood. She already did. Claire frowned. What? More than I knew. He walked toward the window. College, the first house, Riverside. That was before. No, that's the point. He turned toward his wife. She kept fixing things before I even understood they were broken. Claire folded her arms. And now she's teaching you a lesson. No. That's exactly what this is. No, Claire, this is us. She stared at him. Ethan pointed around the kitchen. Mom didn't make us buy this house. We could afford it. We could afford it if everything went perfectly. That's not the same thing. I know that now. His voice softened. Mom didn't make us refinance. She didn't make us buy 2 expensive cars. She didn't make us count a bonus before I earned it. Claire's eyes filled. You're blaming me. No. Yes, you are. I'm blaming myself too. That was new. The Ethan I had known over the previous several years would have found someone else responsible. The lender, Jonathan, the economy, me. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from Claire and sat down. I liked it. What? The way people looked at us. Claire said nothing. I liked your parents thinking I was successful. I liked being the guy who could pay for everything. I even liked people thinking I was supporting Mom. Claire looked away. Ethan continued. Do you know she heard us at the hospital? Claire's face changed. Heard what? Your mother asking why I was still helping her. Oh. I told Patricia Mom didn't have anyone else. Claire closed her eyes. I know. She heard me. Neither spoke for a while. Then Ethan said something that surprised even himself. The problem isn't that my mother stopped helping us. Claire looked at him. The problem is that we built a life that required her help without even knowing it. 2 days later, Ethan called a real estate agent. They listed the house. When he told me, I felt no satisfaction. That matters. I didn't sit in my modest kitchen smiling because my wealthy-looking son had been humbled. I cried, not because they were selling a house, because I finally understood how frightened Ethan had been for months. And because I had once believed protecting him from fear was the same as helping him become strong. It wasn't. The house received an offer quickly. They would lose some money after transaction costs, but selling would dramatically reduce their monthly expenses. Ethan kept his job. Claire kept hers. They were not poor. They were not ruined. They were simply being forced to live within reality. For people accustomed to appearances, reality can feel like disaster. A few evenings later, Rebecca and I were leaving a community housing meeting when she asked, Have you heard from Ethan? Not directly. He's handling the Riverside revisions well. I looked at her. Really? Jonathan says he's stopped defending the original projections and started fixing them. I couldn't help smiling. That sounds like progress. It does. Then Rebecca added, He's also stopped asking whether the guarantee might come back. That mattered even more. At home that night, I walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest, where I had kept Thomas's things. The space where his blue shirt had once been was still visible among the folded clothes. I thought about the blanket. I had assumed it was still in the gift bag in my spare bedroom. But when I checked, the bag was empty. I stared inside. Then I remembered. At the hospital, I had carried the blanket out with me. Later, during those exhausted first days, I had moved several things around. Had I put it somewhere else, I searched the closet. Nothing. For the first time, I wondered whether I had somehow left it behind after all. The thought made my chest tighten. That blanket was the one gift I had wanted Ben to receive from both grandparents. I told myself I would look again in the morning. But before I could, something else happened. The following evening, shortly after 7, headlights swept across my living room window. A car stopped outside. I looked through the curtains. Ethan stepped out alone. He wasn't carrying a laptop. There was no briefcase, no Riverside folder. He reached into the back seat and lifted something carefully into his arms. Even from the window, I recognized the blue and gray fabric. The blanket. I stood completely still. For the first time since the hospital, my son had come to my house without needing money, advice, influence, or rescue. He walked up the path holding the one thing I thought had been lost. Then he knocked on my door. My son came back without asking for money. For a few seconds, I simply stood behind the door. Ethan was on the other side. Through the narrow glass panel, I could see him looking down at the blue and gray blanket folded over his arms. Thomas's shirt. Ben's blanket. The gift I had carried into the hospital and somehow believed I had carried home again. I opened the door. Ethan looked up. Hi, Mom. Hi. Neither of us moved. Then I looked at the blanket. Where did you get that? He glanced down. The hospital. I thought I brought it home. You brought the gift bag out of the room, but apparently the blanket had been taken out earlier. I frowned. When? A nurse found it with the things you'd brought. Denise. I remembered placing the bag near the nurse's station, moving things around while trying not to cry. In my exhaustion, I must have confused what I had carried back to the car. The hospital called us after we got home, Ethan continued. I picked it up. 3 weeks ago, he nodded. And you never told me. No. That hurt. He saw it. I know. I stepped aside. Come in. Ethan entered the house. Usually when he visited, he dropped his keys on the small table by the door. This time he kept them in his hand, almost as though he wasn't sure he had permission to stay. Coffee, I asked. No thanks. Tea. I'm okay. We went into the living room. Ethan sat on the sofa. I took Thomas's old chair across from him. The blanket remained in his lap. For a moment we said nothing. Then he unfolded one corner. I recognized this. His fingers touched one of the faded blue squares. Dad's shirt. Yes. The one he wore fishing, and everywhere else. Ethan smiled faintly. He wore that thing until the collar was falling apart. He said it was comfortable. He said that about everything Mom wanted him to throw away. I smiled despite myself. For one brief moment Thomas was in the room with us. Then Ethan's smile disappeared. Why did you use it? For Ben. I know. I mean, why Dad's shirt? I looked at the blanket. Because your father never got to meet him. My voice became quieter. I wanted Ben to have something Thomas had touched. Something ordinary. Ethan stared at the fabric. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to. Not until I gave it to him. His eyes filled. I found the stitching. He turned the corner toward me. From those who loved you before you arrived. Ethan read the words aloud. His voice broke on the last one. I looked away. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the old clock near the fireplace. Finally, Ethan said, I couldn't give it to him. I looked back. Why? Because every time I looked at it, I remembered you standing in that hallway. His hands tightened around the fabric. I put it in the nursery closet. That image hurt more than I expected. Thomas's shirt, my stitches, 3 generations folded into a closet because my son couldn't face what he'd done. I almost threw it away once, Ethan said. My face must have changed because he quickly added, I didn't. I can see that. I stood there holding it over a box of things we were donating. He shook his head. And I couldn't do it. Why? Because Dad would have been ashamed of me. I didn't answer. Ethan looked up. Would he? There are moments when kindness requires honesty. Yes. His face crumpled slightly. I continued before the word could become cruelty. But he would still love you. Ethan looked down. So do I. That made him cry. Not dramatically. No sobbing. Just tears he kept wiping away as if embarrassed by them. I'm sorry, Mom. I waited. I know I already said it at the office, but that wasn't enough. No. I was angry. I know. I found out you'd hidden this whole life from me and somehow I made myself the victim. I said nothing. He looked toward the window. I've been thinking about what you asked me. Whether I would have thrown you out of the hospital if I'd known about the company. I felt my chest tighten. And, I don't know. The honesty surprised me. He continued. I wish I could say no. So do I. But I think knowing might have changed how I acted. He looked at me. And that's worse. I understood what he meant. If money would have earned me a place beside my grandson, then the exclusion had never truly been about boundaries. It had been about value. I let Claire decide what kind of mother you were, Ethan said. Claire didn't know me. I did. Yes. And I still let it happen. He leaned forward. She'd say you were old-fashioned, or that you didn't understand our world, or that you might become too involved with Ben. His jaw tightened. I kept choosing whatever made things easier at home. I thought about what I had told him at the hospital. The person expected to understand becomes the easiest person to disappoint. I told myself you could handle it, he said. I usually could. That's not the point. No, it wasn't. I should have defended you when Claire made comments about your clothes. I remembered the navy dress. I should have corrected Patricia when she thought I was supporting you. Yes. I shouldn't have told people I was taking care of you. No. And I should never have asked you to leave that hospital. His voice cracked. You were there all night. I swallowed. You were scared. That doesn't excuse it. No. He looked almost relieved that I hadn't tried to rescue him from his own apology. I saw you waiting, he said. Every time I walked into the hallway, I saw you sitting there with that bag. My eyes burned. And I still let Claire's sister go in before you. I looked down. I know. Why didn't you yell at me? I almost laughed. Would that have helped? No. Then why? Because you were becoming a father. I wasn't going to turn Ben's birth into a battlefield. Ethan stared at me. Even after everything, you were protecting me. The words made me uncomfortable because they were true. Maybe too much. He nodded slowly. I think you did. That was another surprise. I've been thinking about that too, he said. The house, college, Riverside, all those things I thought just worked out. You still worked for them. I know. He smiled sadly. I'm finally starting to understand the difference. He told me about Jonathan, about losing the partnership opportunity, about the reduced Riverside plan, about listing the house. He didn't ask me to fix any of it. Not once. The offer on the house is good, he said. We'll be okay. I'm glad. We're looking at a smaller place. Good. Claire hates that I'm calling it smaller. I smiled. What does she call it? More manageable. She's in marketing. That actually made Ethan laugh. Then the room became quiet again. He folded the blanket carefully. Mom, I don't expect you to trust me because I came here and said the right things. Good. I don't expect everything to go back to normal. It shouldn't. He nodded. I just need you to know I'm sorry. I studied my son. For weeks I had imagined what an apology might feel like. I thought perhaps it would release something. Instead, I felt cautious. Love was still there. Love had never left. Trust was different. I believe you're sorry, I said. His eyes met mine. But trust will take longer. I know. And Claire, we're working on things. That wasn't my question. He understood. She knows I came. Does she agree with what you're saying? Some of it? Some. Mom, she's scared. So were you. Yes, he sighed. But I finally told her being scared doesn't make your money ours. That sentence mattered, more than he knew. I nodded. Ethan looked at the blanket again. There's something else I wanted to ask. My body tensed automatically. He noticed. And for the first time, I think he understood exactly what that reaction meant. Not money, he said quickly. I relaxed slightly. What? Can I bring Ben here next Sunday? I didn't answer immediately. Claire too, if you're comfortable. Why? Ethan looked confused. Because he's your grandson. I waited. He added, and because I want him to know you. Not the chairwoman, not the owner of Riverside, not the woman with an estate large enough to change his future. Me. I looked toward Thomas's photograph on the mantel. Sunday would be fine. Ethan smiled. Okay. He stood and handed me the blanket. I pushed it gently back toward him. No. He looked surprised. It's Ben's. Are you sure? I made it for him. Ethan held it against his chest. At the door he stopped. Mom. Yes. I don't want your money. I looked at him carefully. Don't make promises because you're ashamed. I'm not. You don't know what your life will look like 10 years from now. He nodded. Then let me say it differently. He took a breath. I don't want money to be the reason you let me back into your life. That I believed. It won't be. He nodded. Then he left. I watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time since Ben's birth, I didn't feel abandoned. But I didn't feel healed either. Healing, I was beginning to understand, was quieter than forgiveness. It happened through repetition, through changed behavior, through apologies that didn't demand immediate absolution, through showing up when there was nothing to gain. The following Sunday, Ethan returned. This time he wasn't alone. Claire stepped out of the passenger side. Then Ethan opened the back door and carefully lifted Ben from his car seat. The blue and gray blanket was wrapped around my grandson. Thomas's shirt rested against his tiny chest. I stood in my doorway watching 3 generations walk toward me. Nothing was fixed. Not yet. But for the first time they weren't coming because they needed Melissa Grant to rescue them. They were coming because they wanted me there. And that was where trust could finally begin again. Who I really was. 6 months after Ben was born, Ethan and Claire moved out of the house they once believed proved they had succeeded. I expected that day to be painful for them. Instead, it seemed to bring relief. Their new home was a 3-bedroom brick house in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from mine. It had a small backyard, an ordinary kitchen, and a mortgage they could comfortably afford. The first time I visited, Claire apologized because the dining room still contained unopened boxes. I looked around. "Looks like a home to me," she smiled. 6 months earlier, she might have heard criticism in those words. Now she simply said, "It does, doesn't it?" Change rarely announces itself. It appears in small things. Claire stopped talking about what other families owned. Ethan stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes during dinner. They canceled memberships they didn't need and discovered that most of the people worth knowing still answered their calls. Their marriage did not magically repair itself. They began counseling. There were arguments. There were difficult conversations about money and the pressure Claire felt to impress her parents. Ethan had his own admissions to make. He had enjoyed being admired. He had exaggerated his independence. He had hidden financial pressure because admitting fear felt too much like failure. Neither of them became a different person overnight, but they began becoming more honest versions of themselves. That was enough for me. At Pierce Development, Ethan voluntarily stepped away from leading Riverside. Jonathan had not asked him to. "I need to earn my credibility back," Ethan told me. He remained involved in portions of the project, but another executive took primary responsibility. His partnership opportunity disappeared for the foreseeable future. He accepted that. More importantly, he stopped treating every professional setback as an emergency someone else needed to solve. I watched from a distance. I did not call Jonathan. I did not create a position for Ethan at Grant Community Holdings. I did not restore the guarantee. My son kept working, and slowly he became better. Not richer, better. Claire changed differently. At first, every visit to my house felt careful. She seemed afraid that one wrong sentence would make me think she wanted money. Then one afternoon, when Ben was nearly 4 months old, she arrived looking exhausted. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you get Ethan to sleep when he was teething?" I laughed. "I didn't." She stared at me. "You must have done something." I walked around the living room at 2 in the morning, wondering why anyone willingly had children. Claire laughed so hard she nearly woke Ben. That afternoon we talked for 2 hours. Not about Riverside, not about inheritance, about motherhood. The next week she asked if I would watch Ben while she went to a doctor's appointment. That question meant more to me than any apology. Trust was returning through ordinary things. Ben grew quickly. He learned to recognize my voice. When Ethan brought him over, his entire face began lighting up when he saw me. I kept a basket of toys in the living room. The blue and gray blanket usually came with him. Sometimes I would find myself touching one of the squares from Thomas's shirt. It no longer made me only sad. It felt like Thomas had found his way into the room after all. Then, one Saturday morning, I asked Ethan and Claire to meet me at one of our construction sites outside Richmond. "Is this about Riverside?" Ethan asked. "No." "Should I wear a suit?" "No." "That makes me more nervous." "Bring comfortable shoes." They arrived with Ben shortly after 10. The project was still under construction. Several brick buildings surrounded a landscaped central courtyard. Wide sidewalks connected the units to a community center. Claire looked around. "What is this D72 apartments?" "For seniors," Ethan asked. "Independent living, mostly." We walked toward one of the completed units. The counters were accessible. Doorways were wide. Cabinets had been lowered. Ethan noticed me checking the kitchen shelves. "You designed this?" "Not personally." "But this is your project." One of them. We continued toward the community center. Inside, Rebecca was waiting. Ethan stopped. "Oh no," Rebecca laughed. "Good morning to you too." He looked at me. "Why is your lawyer here?" "Because I want to talk about something." Claire immediately became tense. I noticed. So did Ethan. I led them into a small meeting room. Ben sat on Claire's lap, chewing the corner of a soft toy. Rebecca placed several folders on the table. Ethan looked at them. "Mom, if this is about inheritance, it is." Claire looked down immediately. That told me something. 6 months earlier, she would have leaned forward. I sat across from them. "After your father died, I started thinking about what should eventually happen to the company." Ethan said nothing. "For years, the easiest answer seemed to be leaving most of it to you." His eyes lifted. "But easy isn't always wise." I looked toward Ben. "And after he was born, I became certain." Claire shifted slightly. "Certain about what?" "Most of my estate will not pass directly to family." The room became silent. Ethan's expression barely changed. Claire's did, but only for a second. I continued. "Rebecca and I are establishing the Grant Family Foundation." Rebecca slid a document forward. "The foundation will eventually receive the majority of Melissa's controlling assets." Ethan looked at me. "What will it do?" I smiled. "Things your father would recognize. Affordable senior housing, support for family caregivers, emergency assistance for older women facing housing insecurity, scholarships connected to construction and community development, programs for widows who suddenly find themselves responsible for finances they never managed during their marriages." As I explained it, Ethan's expression softened. "Dad would have loved that." "Yes." I felt my throat tighten. "He would." Claire finally spoke. "What about Ben?" I looked at her. She immediately added, "I'm not asking how much he'll get. I mean, where does he fit?" That distinction mattered. "Ben will have opportunities, education, security, a reasonable family trust. But he will not grow up believing his grandmother's money is his future." Claire nodded. "I understand." And I believed she did. Ethan leaned back. "So that's it." "What?" "The company." "Not exactly." He looked at me. I glanced toward Rebecca. She opened another folder. "The foundation will need a board." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "I'm not asking you to join it." His expression fell slightly. "Not yet." "Oh, you have your own career." "I do." "And you still have things to prove." He smiled faintly. "I definitely do. But someday, if you want to be involved, there may be a place. Because I'm your son." "No." His smile disappeared. "Then why?" "Because if you become the kind of man I believe you're capable of becoming, you might have something valuable to contribute." He was quiet. "That's not a promise," I said. "I know. No guaranteed chair. I understand. No inheritance disguised as responsibility." That made him smile. "I understand, Mom." Then he said the one thing I had not expected. "I think that's better." I stared at him. "What?" "The foundation." He looked around the room. "If you gave me everything, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering whether anything I built was mine." 6 months earlier, those words would have sounded defensive. Now they sounded peaceful. "And Ben?" I asked. Ethan looked at his son. "I want him to know he has a family that loves him." He glanced at me. "Not a fortune waiting for him." I felt something loosen inside me. Perhaps that was the moment I finally forgave him. Not because he said the perfect thing, because I no longer recognized the man who had stood in that hospital hallway. We left the meeting room and walked through the courtyard. Ben became restless, so Claire handed him to Ethan. A few minutes later, Ethan brought him to me. "Here." I took my grandson. He was heavier now. His dark little curls had begun to show, and his hands immediately reached for my necklace. "You're getting too big," I whispered. Ethan stood beside me. For a moment, we watched construction workers across the courtyard. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something." That sounds dangerous, he smiled. That day at the hospital. My smile faded. I thought I knew exactly who you were. I looked at him. The house. The Toyota. Dad's widow. My mother who needed me. He shook his head. I was so sure I understood your whole life. You understood parts of it. Not enough. Ben grabbed my finger. Ethan watched him. I want him to know who his grandmother really is. There it was. The title of everything we had survived, though neither of us knew it. For months, people had treated the revelation of my wealth as the answer. Who was Melissa Grant, chairwoman, investor, property owner, millionaire? But those were things I possessed. They weren't who I was. I was the 24-year-old bookkeeper who counted dollars at a kitchen table. I was Thomas's wife. I was the woman who helped repair a broken duplex because we couldn't afford contractors. I was the mother who had protected her son too often. I was the grandmother who had sat outside a hospital room holding a blanket nobody wanted. I was also the woman who eventually learned that love without boundaries could become another form of fear. I looked at Ethan, then let him know me. He waited. I smiled. Not my money. His eyes filled. He nodded. I will. Bun tightened his tiny hand around my finger. Across the courtyard stood buildings that would someday house people who might otherwise feel forgotten. Beside me stood a son who had once made me feel exactly that way. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need Ethan humiliated. I didn't need Claire punished. The consequences had done what punishment never could. They had forced all of us to see ourselves clearly. Ethan had learned that success without humility was fragile. Claire had learned that security couldn't be borrowed from someone else's bank account. And I had learned perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes loving your children means helping them. And sometimes loving them means stepping aside and letting them discover they can stand without you. I kissed Ben's forehead. Thomas wasn't there. But his name was, his shirt was, his values were. And perhaps that was what legacy really meant. Not leaving behind enough money that your family never struggled,